Okay. As you know, I prefer exact starts, so it's 15:15, and we will start. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you at a already 6th Sustainable Use Directive Symposium. This year we will focus on the arable crops, as properly suggested by our chairman last year. I take this opportunity to introduce again, 6th time, our chairman, which is always the one and only Professor Michael Hamel.
Very early.
I would like to thank our organizational partners as well, the International Organization for Biological Control, our researchers, as continued research and European fundings for innovation and sustainable agriculture is a vital component in ensuring this progressing trends continues. Also, International Biocontrol Manufacturer Association, IBMA, biocontrol industries produce solutions with microorganisms, semiochemicals and natural products for plant protection. And last but not least, the Pesticides Action Network Europe, my favorite and beloved, a NGO, Brussels-based, working to minimize effects and replace the use of hazardous chemicals with ecologically sound alternatives. And believe me, they are working hard on this. Just to mention a few technical issues, we have a translation in English on channel 2. We have a French translation on channel 3 and Italian on channel 4. You should also know that symposium is web streamed live in Germany, Portugal, Switzerland and Sweden, and it will be followed by local debates in a number of universities. We thank you for this, and we hope that you all everywhere can hear us and see us well. And I would also like to ask speakers to use only left side micro, because we have sort of automatic aiming system, and we have to help these all electronic friends to work. To the content, just few words. Arable crops is a challenging field, but this is a challenge that must be tackled. It is an important step in the development of the integrated pest management in all agriculture. In the IPN triangle, the good agronomic practices are an essential base. EU Sustainable Plant Protection Group proposed and was endorsed by the Council of Ministers for a 40-point action plan, bringing IPM as a standard practice within EU agriculture and providing more low-risk plant protection tools to European farmers alongside with all the other tools such as agronomic and mechanic ones. On Directive 2009/128 on sustainable use of pesticides, I only need to say that my honourable colleague Jutta Gutteland from Sweden was appointed a S&D rapporteur for the implementation report, and she will join us for last panel today. Her work is closely related to the implementation report on the plant protection product regulation, on which I am working as a rapporteur currently, but because speaking more about the implementation of the plant protection product regulation is for me a bit depressive after the first research on this topic, so I pass to Michael to guide us through this marvelous event. Michael.
Thank you, Pavel. And at the very outset, thank you for the continued support that you have given to this symposium year upon year. It's not an exaggeration to say that the work of the organizations that have sponsored or have supported this and developed this conference year after year is dependent on you for entry into the European Parliament, for discussion within the confines of the Parliament on a subject very close to the citizen, very close to the farmer. And your continued support is immensely important. The focus of this meeting as you said, is the 2009 Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, its implementation, and especially with respect to integrated pest management, IPM. In previous years, the symposium has dealt with many aspects of implementation and the problems related to the achievement of IPM, which clearly through each of the symposia has the support of farmers, has the support of the industry in its widest sense, and has the support of consumers. Now, that support, and I've asked for comments in that line each year, that support has always been reaffirmed, not always without caveats, but always with a desire to improve the health and the well-being of all concerned and the broader environment. And the caveats, I'm afraid, mimic St. Augustine, for those of you who follow great religious movements. Lord, give us IPM, but not yet. 2009 to now is 9 years, so maybe not yet can be said sotto voce. Previous symposia have laid emphasis on what IPM is. The simple triangle of good agricultural practice, including rotations, monitoring, forecasting, warning systems, natural and biological control, and then, where necessary, chemical control. The symposia are building up a base of knowledge. We've looked at the greenhouse sector, we've looked at the apple sector, we've looked at grapes, table grapes and grapes for wine production. We provided the state of play and progress on IPM and problems along the way in all of those sectors. There has been strong criticism of the absence of the 2014 Commission report on Member State implementation, and largely through the work of PAN, but through the work of others also, a considerable criticism of the lack of ambition in Member States' implementation of the directive and in their plans in order to implement the directive. Criticism, too, of the registration process, of funding, not just for research, but for research, for education, and criticism of what appears to be a hesitant buy-in to the practicalities of IPM as opposed to the favourable remarks in terms of wanting it to happen. Today's symposium, as Pavel has said, tackles the arable sector. This would have been inconceivable 6 years ago when we started the process. IPM was seen as something for greenhouses and not much more. And here we are in the field. It's divided into 3 parts. The first focuses on soil. The second with mainstreaming IPM into arable. And the third with integrating IPM into policy and practice. So 3 different parts. When I was a child, we were told by Caesar that all Gaul was divided in 3 parts. This conference, or this symposium, is divided in 3 parts, and France will play an important part in it. We've had the Commission report on implementation since last October. We still have unfinished business with regard to the Sustainable Use Directive and the Common Agricultural Policy and the linkage there. And we still have, across Europe, a perilous situation for biodiversity and for water, which are not unrelated to the non-sustainable use of pesticides. So we have much to discuss, and we have an excellent panel of speakers and subsequently an excellent panel of commentators. And I want a great amount of participation from the floor, and I will ensure that that takes place. So let's go to the first part straight away. There are 3 speakers. Luca Montanarella on my left from the JRC, Céline Pelosi from INRA, and Fabrice Martin Laurent from INRA. And we start with you, Luca. It's a pleasure to introduce you. We started working together, and I can't say this for anybody else in the room, so this is the one and only speech of introduction of somebody. We started working together on soil protection 30 years ago. Or sorry, 20 years ago. You can make your own judgments on whether we made any progress or not. Luca.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. And good afternoon to everybody. As Michael was saying, I'm working at the European Commission in the service of the European Commission called Joint Research Centre. For the ones who are not familiar with it, this is the service of the Commission that is there to provide science, policy and data to support our colleagues who do policy. In that case, when we started 20 years ago to think about EU soil policy for soil protection, providing information, data and support for that policy area. Indeed, my job is essentially to work on soils, so here I was asked to tell you a few things about soils in Europe, particularly the threats to soils and particularly some status, methods, drivers and effects on ecosystem services. To present something like this would probably need a lot of time, so I will try to be focused. But I would like to spend at least a few words on something that is very important to us and particularly to me, which is the absolute need to base what we do on facts, figures, data, measurements, and not on virtual realities or what nowadays is called fake news or impressions. This for soils, of course, is a little bit complicated because when you want to talk about soils, about facts about soils, you need to do something which we call as soil scientists to dig a soil profile. You need to go in the field, dig a hole, observe what you see, take a sample, bring it to the lab. And this is quite a time-consuming exercise, by the way, a very instructive exercise in my view, but it brings you back to reality and it brings you back to the facts and figures that you need when you want to then take some decisions. Now, from the moment that we start collecting data, so collecting samples, till the moment that we produce what we call an assessment that goes then on your tables as a report or as something that you can use in your work, that's a long process, and we have been investing a lot of time and effort in documenting in a very detailed way how we get from the field observation of soil properties till the final assessment of the situation of soils for certain threats or for certain parameters you're interested in. Now, usually doing that requires also combining your soil data with other information. I will give you an example of that, because just talking about soils in isolation is not reality. Reality is that soils are embedded in a landscape, are embedded in a society, are embedded in an economic field, are embedded in a lot of things that needs to be taken into consideration when you do an integrated assessment on a complicated topic, a complex issue like soils. Now, we do this at the European Commission through something that we established already quite some years ago, actually nearly 20 years ago, as Michael was saying, you may access all soil information data and all what we do freely over the European Soil Data Center. The European Soil Data Center is hosted by the European Commission Joint Research Center, and it's collecting all policy-relevant information coming from very different sources. We take data directly from our member states, but of course we also have a number of other data flows coming from Commission activities, like, for example, our own research activities, but also our own monitoring and data collection exercises, and I will talk a little bit more about that. The data center has a backbone. The backbone soil information system is what you see here, is the European Soil Information System, which is going far beyond, by now, the 28 EU member states. This for the simple reason that very early we realized that our bordering countries were very interested to join this system, but as well that many of the policies that we have to support with our data information are going beyond the borders of the EU, and that's why actually we are pretty active also now at global scale in supporting various agencies at global scale like FAO, UNEP, and various multilateral environmental agreements. You don't only need to have maps and GIS systems and data in a spatial distribution, but if you want to make a statement about trends, you need also to have the possibility to detect changes over time. Changes over time requires that you go and do what we call monitoring. Monitoring means you go over time, in the same spot, you take a sample, you measure what you want to measure, and you can compare then your results over time. This is again an extremely time-consuming and costly exercise. We are lucky that by now we have established our own system, which is the system that we currently operate as European Commission, which is called LUCAS. We stand for the European Land Use Land Cover Frame Statistical Survey. It's a pretty structured system that goes on already since several years, based on 1,100,000 points on a regular grid at 2-kilometer spacing all over the EU. That is, of course, a huge data set containing a lot of information about land use, land cover, but since 2009 also about soils, because our surveyors also go and take a soil sample. And I will talk a little bit more about that, because that gives us the possibility to detect reality, what is actually happening in EU soils and what are the current situation concerning certain parameters. Now, of course, you can imagine it's very expensive to go on 1,100,000 points every 3 years. So we usually do what we call a stratification. So we make a selection of points based on certain criteria, particularly criteria of what is more interesting to us. So essentially type of land use. Very often we are much more interested in agricultural soils than in other types of soils. So there is a stratification exercise that allows us to then go just on roughly 250,000 points. Of those, then a number is sampled for soil parameters. Now, just now it's going on the training in Lisbon for the new survey that we are doing in 2018. We did the first survey of soil on this grid in 2009. The next one was done in 2015, and the current one is 2018, so every 3 years. And this is a highly documented system that allows them to derive a number of properties. I don't want to go into detail of what we measure, but 2 things are fundamental to be successful in this exercise. Is the very, very high standardization of what we do. So we have been ruling out all the problems that we had in the past in comparing data across EU member states. That has usually been a high problem due to the very difficult issue of interlaboratory calibration and very large differences in methods and in analytical methods used in laboratories at national level. And the second one is that we maintain an European soil archive. So you have a permanent archive of samples that you can go back and reanalyze for certain parameters if you are interested. And of course, having tens of thousands of soil samples within a very georeference location is a big wealth of information that you can go back if you have any doubts about some issue. Now, what do we measure are things that are policy relevant. One of the most policy relevant things recently is soil organic carbon. You may know that we have a big stock of soil organic carbon in soils, and this is quite a relevant parameter for many reasons, more recently for climate change issues, because if you mineralize those carbon, this will go in the atmosphere and you increase your CO2 balance. And of course, this has not very positive for our general greenhouse gas balance. So we have now the results of our Lucas survey on soil organic carbon that tell us that soil organic carbon is consistently declining in European soils, and actually the estimates that we had 20 years ago was hugely overestimated. We have much less carbon left than we originally thought. Now, there are many other parameters that we measure in that survey that are more relevant to health, to human health particularly, and to our food safety. Here I show the distribution of major heavy metals. I don't want to go into detail, but that's just to tell you that we measure heavy metals concentration in European soils that are, of course, sometimes concern because they can enter the food chain. There was a big debate recently on cadmium, for example, around the fertilizer regulation, but also other issues like copper in vineyards and so on. Now, let me just make one example of a more integrated assessment, and I will do this on the soil erosion issue. This because soil erosion is remaining a major threat to European soils. Now, the soil erosion assessment is a typical example where we combine data from many different sources, not only the soil observations, but also meteorological data, because you need to have rainfall data. You have to have slope information because it depends on your slope if you have erosion or not. And of course also land cover and vegetation cover and management practices. And I will not go into detail, but this just to explain to you the complexity of an assessment for just one of those threats. Now the result of such an exercise is a number of maps of different parameters, for example, soil erosivity, which depends on type of soil, or rainfall erosivity, which depends on rainfall intensity. And usually the result that then goes up to our colleagues doing more policy is maps of this kind, where you have the distribution of the rate of erosions in tons per hectares per year of soil loss, usually aggregated by administrative units, which is the map that you see on the right-hand side, which is, of course, then helpful if you want to take policy decision on that parameters. And as you can see, it's pretty reddish in the Mediterranean area because the Mediterranean typically experiences quite high erosion rates above the 10 tons per hectares per year, which is considered in general as the threshold where erosion becomes a serious problem. Now, of course, when you do this type of products and assessment, you can combine then this with other things which are also very interesting. Quite interesting was what we did end of last year when we published a paper that made some noise, which was a combination of our soil erosion assessment for wind, so wind erosion, together with the measurements of pesticide residues in Lucas samples. And as you know, we have also measuring, for example, residues of glyphosate and its metabolite, AMPA, which is the paper just here on the screen, and where we combine the results of the distribution of glyphosate and its metabolite together with the areas which are mostly prone to wind erosion. Why is this interesting? Because, of course, you may have that the areas which have a high wind erosion rate are also high in having some of these residues, and you could assume that some of these residues are attached to the particles that get into the atmosphere through the wind erosion process. So you could have here one way of transfer of the molecules from the soil to the atmosphere, and then, of course, eventually being inhalated by humans or by others. This was a paper that was just showing how you can combine different information coming from the same survey, so we're talking here of the data from the Lucas survey that I was just mentioning, with other information coming from the modeling exercise on wind erosion, which is quite interesting. Typically you will have more wind erosion where there's less vegetation cover, and obviously if you use more herbicide you have less vegetation cover, so it's pretty obvious results, which honestly didn't surprise us that much. Now all this feeds into a number of reports that you can find everywhere. We are there to provide data for official reporting to different agencies, not only internally to the Commission services, but also to OECD, to all the agencies that require reporting about soils. And of course, now coming to the question, what is the status of the European soils? We should refer back to the most recent comprehensive assessment that we did. We did this together with the Global Soil Partnership, with the Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soils, where in 2015 was released the most updated status of world soil resources, which contains more than 600 pages, but which contains particularly a specific chapter about European soils. And I just show you the synthesis table of the European chapter, where you will have the ranking of the major degradation processes occurring in the European region. And be aware, we are talking here of the UN European regions, not of the EU, so the region that you see depicted up there, which is pretty bigger than the European Union, but which has a ranking with the trends of the various threats. And what was ranking first as the major threat in our region is soil sealing and land take by housing and infrastructure. So this is what this assessment has been produced as the first problem in our region, with a pretty negative trend. As you can see, the trend lines are these arrows in the columns. I don't know if you can see it, the screens are pretty small. The second ranking threat was, interestingly, soil salinization and solidification. This for the simple reason that this region covers many Central Asian republics that belonged to the former Soviet Union, which have very serious salinization problems. So that's just the explanation. But the third ranking threat was soil contamination, with very interestingly a positive trend, in the sense that the assessment showed that there is improvement in this region concerning soil contamination, mostly because there is some improvement in handling contaminated sites. As you know, we have a heritage of roughly 3 million contaminated sites in Europe, and there is quite some effort going on in some countries in remediating contaminated sites. I don't go through the ranking of all the threats. I mean, you will find then decline of soil organic carbon, loss of soil biodiversity, soil compaction, many others. There's not enough time to go into detail, but that should tell you that this is available and you can consult it. The second assessment that came out in the same year, 2015, by the way, 2015 was the UN International Year of Soils. That's why there was so much done on soils in 2015, is the assessment done by the European Environment Agency with the support from us, from the GRC, which is essentially coming to the same conclusions of the global assessment for Europe. Indeed, we have here in Europe still a persisting problem of soil degradation by contamination, by soil sealing, by loss of soil organic carbon, and so on. Now, coming to the final part of this brief presentation, which was aiming also to address ecosystem services and the fact that, of course, soil degradation is affecting life in soil, and soils are alive, by the way. And to prove that soils are alive, by the way, we have made a big investment as the European Commission in publishing last year the Global Soil Biodiversity Atlas. I have just one copy, but I'm happy to leave it here. But you can freely available from the European Commission or downloadable from our website. And this is an assessment of soil biodiversity, because soil biodiversity is a pretty unknown biodiversity pool. A bit neglected in the sense that people think soils are dead, so no reason to care for them. But soils are not dead. They are alive. They are a big engine that is performing many services to us that are very crucial. And, of course, if you have degradation of soils, these services may be lost. And you can find in that document all the details about these interactions between soil degradation, ecosystem services, and soil biodiversity. So let me conclude with more recent things and a little bit an outlook. You may know that there is now a growing attention at global scale for soil contamination and soil pollution. You may know that the last United Nations Environment Assembly in December last year, that was decided to have an assessment, a global assessment by UNEP on soil pollution. This, of course, will trigger, I think, quite some activities in the next year or years on soil contamination and soil pollution globally. We just released within the Global Soil Partnership another booklet that I have only one copy, but again you can download it, which is the global assessment of the impact of plant protection products on soil functions and soil ecosystems. I'm sorry, I have just one copy, but it's freely downloadable from the Global Soil Partnership website. And the second thing I would like to announce here is that we will organize a major event on soil contamination, soil pollution, hosted by FAO together with the other UN agencies, namely the GSP, the Global Soil Partnership, the Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soils, UNEP, the World Health Organization, the Basel Convention, and the Stockholm Convention in Rome in May. You have there the announcement. And I hope that some of you will attend. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Luca. I think the wisest thing is to leave the questions till the end because the sessions are so clearly delineated. So without further ado then, unless somebody has something very critical, and even if they have, the answer is no, let's go on to Céline Pelosi from INRA in Versailles, whose subject is how pesticides are affecting earthworms. So, Céline.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Céline. I'm from France. I am a soil ecotoxicologist, and I work at INRA, which is the National Institute of Agronomical Research in France. I'm based in Versailles, and I'm going to talk about how pesticides are affecting earthworms. So as Luca mentioned, to assess the impact of anthropic activities and the threats to ecosystems, we use biomonitoring procedures that can be done under laboratory or field conditions. And both approaches have different levels of precision in the results and relevance for policy. So in that context, we can use bioindicators, which are a species or a group of species which occurrence gives some information on the quality of the ecosystem. And these bioindicators can be used to assess the impacts of anthropic activities, to describe the systems, and to follow their evolution after a change. To be relevant to assess the impact of pesticides, the bioindicators must be representative of the areas where pesticides are applied. They, if possible, they must play an important functional role in the systems, in the ecosystems, and they have to be sensitive in an agricultural context, which means a low concentration of chemicals but repeated and chronic exposure. In cultivated fields, earthworms represent about 80% of soil-living biomass, and they are heavily involved in functioning because they ensure some functions such as the evolution of organic matter and soil structure, and they are as well praised for different types of living organisms. So depending on the species and on the ecological groups to which they belong, they have different roles and they live in different places and feed different things. So concerning the sensitivity, it's described as physiological, morphological, phenological, or behavioral change or response after an exposure to a pollutant. And the sensitivity depends on the species, so the feeding habits or the place where they live. For instance, Eisenia foetida is a species that is recommended in the international norms. Since the 80s, it has been chosen because it has a short generation time and it's easy to breed, quite easy to breed. So today, it's used in this norm. It's recommended in this norm that allow to assess the impacts of pollutants on mortality, survival of earthworms, reproduction, and behavior. And these tests are used before the registration of pesticides. And so this species, Eisenia foetida, is used in about 80% of ecotoxicological study that we can find in the scientific literature. However, it's a composting worm, so this species is not present in mineral soils where pesticides are applied. Based on a meta-analysis we did a few years ago in 2013, and based on all the literature that was available on the LC50, which is the lethal concentration to kill 50% of the individuals, we highlighted that Eisenia foetida was 2 times less sensitive than other earthworm species that can be found in the field. And it's more than 3 times less sensitive than an earthworm species very frequent in cultivated fields. So for my own research, I use earthworm species that can be found in natural conditions in agricultural fields. I work with natural soils and with realistic concentration, including the recommended dose in the fields. And I work with commercial formulation, not pure molecules, and mainly with commercial formulation that are representative of the practices for cereal crops, so in arable fields, and that have potential effects taking into account the toxic reference values and the recommended dose. So I use this strategy to study the impact of, we can use this strategy to assess the impact of pesticides at different levels of biological organization, whatever it's in the lab or in the field. And I will show you, I will give you a brief overview of the potential effect of pesticides at the different levels of organization. So first, some authors studied the impact on DNA damage, and they highlighted 97% more damage with chlorpyrifos made pesticide, which it's a commercial formulation made of chlorpyrifos. It's an insecticide. And so they found, in that case, big DNA damage compared to the control earthworm exposed to soil without pesticide. You can see on that graph that, for instance, for glyphosate, there was no effect on DNA damage in that case. Secondly, you can have some effects at the cell level. For instance, some earthworms were exposed to opus, which is a commercial formulation of epoxiconazole, which is a fungicide, on the earthworm species Allolobophora ecterica, which is a common species in the field. And we could find transitory effects on enzymatic activities, which is a cell defense towards oxidative stress when the earthworms are exposed to pesticides. And along with a decrease in energy reserves. So we could highlight some effects at the cell level. And this effect at the gene and the cell level can have consequences at the individual level, because it can divert the energy from the vital functions that the organism have to ensure. So after an exposure to swing gold, which is a commercial formulation of a fungicide made of epoxiconazole and demoxystrobin, we found some effects, some negative effect on the reproduction at the recommended dose, because I forgot to say that, but all that result were at the recommended dose in the field. So we could find minus 35% of cocoons produced, so these are the eggs produced by earthworms, and so quite big effects on reproduction, and minus 20% of hatchlings, so the cocoons cannot hatch, so you don't have any newborns. And at 3 times the recommended dose, that is a realistic concentration, because these molecules are quite persistent in the environment, we found minus 50% of cocoons produced, minus 33% of hatchlings, and the hatchlings needed 5 days more to hatch. We also assessed the impact on the growth, and we could find that the earthworm, the juveniles, needed 9 days more to become adults. So all these results can have, all these effects can have some consequences at the population level and the population dynamics. And we used some data from organic and conventional cropping systems. We made the sampling in loamy soils in France with a neutral pH. All the plots were plowed, and we were under winter wheat crop. And all the plots received the same time and the same proportion of organic inputs because it's important for earthworms. And we highlighted a negative impact, that an increase in the total TFI, which is a treatment frequency index. We use it as a pressure index. So an increase in the TFI led to a decrease in earthworm abundance for 3 earthworm species commonly found in the field. And we showed that the more an earthworm species lives near to the soil surface, the more it's affected by pesticide applications. So we used this mathematical relationship to predict the effect of a decrease in the TFI as it was planned by the Ecophyto plan. And we could have multiplied by 4 or by 1.5 the abundance of these 3 earthworm species if the TFI is divided by 2. Not finally, at the community level, we can also highlight some consequences of pesticides. For instance, this is a study that was done in shaded coffee plots in Mexico. And so the white bar is with herbicide and mainly glyphosate. It was the main herbicide that was used in that trial. And the gray bar is without herbicide. So this study showed that the abundance is higher without glyphosate, without any herbicide than with herbicides. So it wasn't the total community, the total abundance of earthworm. And finally, at the ecosystem level, we can have these authors found effect of imidacloprid, a commercial formulation of imidacloprid on Aporectodea nocturna at a realistic concentration, and they found some effect on earthworm behavior that led to the effect on soil structure, and they found minus 40% of gas diffusion. So finally, as a conclusion, I would say that we cannot say that all the pesticides have negative effects on earthworm, but we cannot say neither that the pesticides have no effect on earthworms, because in my research and in the literature, we can find some negative effects of some pesticides commonly used in Europe at realistic concentration at recommended dose. So by chain reactions, all these effects at the different levels of biological organization can lead to consequences on the ecosystem services and soil quality. And so I wanted to propose some lines of thought for risk assessment, because we have there are some pre-registration procedures, and in that case, for my own research, I recommend to use representative and sensitive earthworm species. So we are working on some proposition for international norms to work on species we can find in the field. And we also recommend to work on other relevant endpoints, such as growth or behavior, that can have consequences on life cycle of the species and the population dynamics that we can follow in the field. For post-registration, we recommend to increase the number of field studies taking into account the confounding factors that we call the confounding factors, such as other agricultural practices. And it's the way to pay attention to the effects of mixture effects, because in the field you don't have just one pesticide or two, but different kinds of pesticide acting at the same time. And as well to work on the exposure of non-target organisms at the landscape scale, taking into account the effects at higher trophic levels. So we are working on some projects in landscape ecotoxicology to assess how the landscape composition and configuration can influence the fate and the effects of pesticides in agricultural landscapes. So I thank you for your attention, and I just wanted to finish with a quote of Charles Darwin, who was really keen on earthworms. He wrote, "Without the work of this humble creature, who knows nothing about the benefits it confers upon mankind, agriculture as we know it would be very difficult, if not wholly impossible, and I would say not sustainable." Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think for me, and I've been involved in soil work for 20-something years, actually 40-something years, that's been an extremely important paper in opening my mind to another dimension. But I'm going to open your mind, and I'm going to invite the opening of our minds to a further dimension, and that's dealing with soil bacteria and fungi, and that's Fabrice Martin-Laurent. Fabrice, also from INRAD.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah. So today we speak about pesticide effect on soil microorganisms. And so we start my talk, as Lucas said, and as Céline said also. So soil is not only the support of the culture, it's also living organisms, as we can say. So it represents an ecological niche in which a huge diversity is hosted, and among the organisms living in soil, microorganisms are numerous. As you can see, in 1 gram of soil, this small tube containing 1 gram of soil, you can find up to 1 billion of bacteria and 1 million of species of bacteria. And you got also a huge diversity of fungal species on the left-hand side, and all these microorganisms are forming a microbial biomass in soil. And for example, for bacteria, it's estimated to 1,500 tons per hectare. It's really a big amount. So they are there, they are numerous, and they are representing a huge diversity. But they are also playing functions, and they are key drivers of a number of soil ecosystemic services, among which nutrient cycling, for example, or water purification, if we are speaking about pesticides. So they are playing a role in the quality of the environments. Although we know that they are there, so they are diverse, present in abundance, and presenting activities contributing to soil ecosystemic services. They are under pressure, anthropic pressure, among which we can see soil usage and agricultural practices may have a clear and strong effect on their diversity, abundance, and activity, and as a consequence, they may change the level of services they support. This is ongoing within the context of the global change, and although we know that they are important, they are still the poor parents from the regulatory point of view. For example, there are no regulatory requirements for post-registration assessment of pesticide effects on soil microorganisms. I would say because of the absence of soil protection directive, although it has been proposed almost 10 years ago to the European Parliament. And if we consider the pre-registration evaluation of environmental risk assessment of pesticide, there is only one measurement that is done, and it is related to the evaluation of the effect of pesticide on the mineralization of nitrogen and carbon. And these two tests are global tests that are not sensitive enough to estimate the ecotoxicological impact of pesticide on microbial communities and on the functions that support soil ecosystemic services. This is the situation now, but what we can say also is that there are plenty of work that are ongoing to propose new ways to estimate the risk for soil microorganisms exposed to pesticide. And for example, in 2010, EFSA published a scientific opinion proposing to follow as a specific protection goals soil ecosystemic services for environmental risk assessment of pesticide. And within this scientific opinion, microorganisms have been identified. Oh, sorry, because I'm moving my slides, but not on the computer. Okay, where am I? Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm here. So because it was moving on my computer and not on the screen, so I have to follow the two screens on there. So EFSA proposed to as a specific protection goals, environmental within the environmental risk assessment, they propose to follow soil ecosystemic services, and they propose also they identify soil microorganisms as key factors to be protected, considering functional groups. Okay, thank you. So in 2006, they published another scientific opinion, and they proposed to include ecological recovery concept in environmental risk assessment of pesticide. And within this concept, they propose also to define normal operating range for each key factor to be protected, including soil microorganisms. And lastly, last year, another scientific opinion was published, and in which a series of standardized methods for pesticide risk assessment in soil living organisms have been published. And for microbes, two kind of targets have been identified. The one that are involved in nitrogen cycle in soil, and the one involved in the endomycorrhizal symbiosis formed with most of plant species. So although all this work has been done, there are a lot of challenges to be tackled because, in fact, we don't know yet what are the targets to be followed, which microbial functions and corresponding proxies have to be evaluated. It's still a question. For each function, nutrient cycling or water purification, which attributes do we have to follow? We need more basic knowledge, genes and enzymes involved in this function. And we, as it was mentioned by EFSA, we also need to define the normal operating range for each of the attributes measured in a given context. And this list is not exhaustive. Many challenges have to be tackled. So within this context, thank you, microbial ecotoxicology emerged This discipline is aiming to study the effect of pollutants on the ecosystem and the effect of pollutants on microbial species and the interaction between microbial species and pollutants. And there are two main questions to be addressed. The first one is to assess the impact of pesticide on microorganisms and on supported function. And the second one is to understand the role of microorganisms and of microbial function on the fate of pesticides. Next slide. So now I will present you some results on advanced researches on risk assessment of pesticide on soil microorganisms. As you understood, we still have to work on it in order to be able to propose methods readily applicable to estimate the effect of pesticide on soil microbial function going on soil. So I will present you some results coming out from an EU project that I have been coordinated. This EcoFund microbiology project was aiming to develop and evaluate innovative tools to assess the impact of pesticide on soil functional microbial diversity. So to do so, we set up a two-tier experiment. The first, the tier 2 experiment was similar to the type of experiment that Céline was presenting. So it's field experiment. It was done in Serbia using the recommended dose, and this was with a pesticide in its commercial form. So we put three treatments, 1 time, 2 times, and 5 times the recommended dose. And we include this in this experiment control plot. And the idea was to measure the toxicity of this, the application of the pesticide. So the pesticide applied was sulfonylurea herbicide, nicosulfuron, used to control annual grass in maize. And the target of this pesticide is an enzyme involved in the biosynthesis of amino acid. So we put also a lab experiment, tier 1, which is the worst case scenario, in which we are not anymore at the recommended dose, but at higher level. It's really to test the toxicity of the pesticide under the worst case scenario. So this was done on the same soil, the Serbian soil, but in France. Starting from this material, we have done several experiments to assess the interest of several ISO standards to estimate pesticide toxicity to soil microorganisms. So, as an example, we study the effect of pesticide application on the abundance, diversity, and activity using ISO standards. But also, what we did, we used methods that are based on soil DNA extraction that has been developed in our laboratory, but now it's an ISO standard. And based on this soil DNA extraction, we are able to quantify microbial groups that are in the soil using qPCR analysis. And so this is an ISO standard now, the 17601. And we applied also sequencing analysis of the DNA to target specific microbial groups. And also we test and develop new methods targeting specific microbial groups, among which arbuscular mycorrhiza that are forming symbiosis with plants, and microbes involved in nitrogen cycle, microbes also tolerant to nicosulfuron. So the first thing when you want to evaluate a pesticide effect on in-soil organisms, on microorganisms living in soil, you have to monitor the fate of the pesticide. So it's what we did here. So you can see that in the Tier 2 scenario, the field X, you can see a clear dissipation of the pesticide. Within 10 days, almost 80% of the pesticide was dissipated. In the Tier 1 scenario, the worst-case scenario, it was totally the opposite. During the first cycle, we can see a dissipation, like it was observed in the Tier 2 scenario. But along the culture cycle, cycle 3, 4, and 5, you can see clearly an accumulation of pesticide residues in soil. So we have a contrasted scenario of exposure. On one end, dissipation, on the other end, accumulation. So I will just show you briefly a few results because there are many of results. But here, for example, in the Tier 2 scenario, we can see a significant increase in the phosphatase activity involved in the phosphate solubility in soil, and a significant decrease in cellobiohydrolase involved in carbon cycle in the soil. And these changes were only transient, and the recovery was observed after 50 days of exposure. On the contrary, on this slide, you can see the diversity of bacteria able to resist to nicosulfuron. And what we can see is that in soil exposed to nicosulfuron, you got an increase, a significant increase in the diversity of these bacteria able to resist to nicosulfuron. So there is a clear trend to the increase in the resistance when there is an exposure to the nicosulfuron. Next slide. The last thing I will show you about the result is the shift in the bacterial community that are able to resist to nicosulfuron. We can see, and this was done in the lab experiment, you can see that the control in red was clearly different from the blue one, the community exposed to nicosulfuron. This was at T2, so the second cycle of culture, and the same trend was observed at T4. Next slide. So to sum up these results, so we follow the number of attributes, and what we can see is that in the field X, almost all the attributes were not responsive to the pesticide, except for the symbiosis with arbuscular mycorrhiza, and for the bacteria resistant tolerant to nicosulfuron. On the contrary, in the Tier 1 scenario, where the worst-case scenario, almost all the tests were positive, so affected by pesticide exposure. So, as we can see from this work, there are a range of indicators that can possibly be used to estimate the effect of pesticide on soil microorganisms. And at ISO, International Standard Organization, there are ongoing work to establish new standards to measure the activity of soil microorganisms, but also the abundance and the diversity. And ongoing work at ISO is done to establish a list of criteria for the selection of indicators for microbial functional indicators, new one, and to identify the most suitable functional indicators in soil microbiology. This is done with the aim to develop a package of standards to measure the abundance, diversity, and activity of functional guilds supporting soil ecosystemic services to monitor their response to various stressors, including pesticides. And within this context, we just deposit a new EU project called Renovate. This project is coordinated by Professor Dimitrios Kapozas. He was involved in the Ecofund microbiology project. And this project is aiming to develop a research and training network for advanced assessment of the ecotoxicity of pesticides on soil microorganisms in Europe. So I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you indeed. Well, I'm going to open it to the floor, but beforehand, I ask Pavel to make some comments. But I think it's fair to say that we've got a global picture, and we've got a more focused picture with relation to earthworms and bacteria and fungi. On soil and arable crops make up 50% of the land of the EU. So let's think about the importance of that. Pavel.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I have two things. First is a remark which will make probably this picture even more darker, and second is a question. So first remark, we are now working on implementation report on plant protection product regulation. So we are after the first 2 rounds of research on this topic. And one of the darkest pictures is that never during the authorization process ecotoxicology data are required. Never. Because on a European level is where is assessed active compound during authorization process is mostly industrial science used and without ecotoxicology data, which is supposed to be assessed somehow during authorization procedures on formulations, which is or supposed to be done on member state level. But after first findings on this, member states are confirming that they don't have from the industry any ecotoxicology data. So during all the authorization process on European level and on the member state level is never assessed ecotoxicology data on pesticides. Just to say what we are assessed, I proposed to assess 5 compounds. First is of course glyphosate, second one is 2,4-D, then bentazone, one of neonicotinoid family, and benzothiastrobin, which is apparent why. So this is a remark, and then questions to both last speakers. When we imagine, and you will for sure know about which compound I am speaking, when we have a active compound which is blocking Shikimate pathway, synthesis of tryptophan. It is in fact not only in plants, it's also in bacteria present, this metabolic pathway. So this compound is in fact antibiotic. It was also patented as an antibiotic. I'm of course speaking about glyphosate, it's apparent. So how would you judge the situation when we are spraying our soil with antibiotic? How it will affect soil microbiome? What would you judge on this? What would you tell us about this? Thank you.
I guess. This is for both. So, Nicosulfuron, I won't say. I will answer to the Shikimate pathway and to which is glyphosate, in fact. but so for the study I show you, nicosulfuron is inhibiting acetohydroxy synthase. So this is the target in plant, but I did not mention it, but 80% of the soil microorganisms have this gene in their chromosome. So as you can say, in the regulation, they are considered as non-target organisms. But from the biological point of view, these non-target organisms are having in their genetic background the target. So this was an introduction to the question you raised. So for the Shikimate pathway and for this glyphosate story, I would say that I don't know if the patent of glyphosate was deposited as an antibiotic. But what I know is that there is a recent paper that was published by American colleague showing that following repeated exposure to glyphosate, they can see an emergence of antibiotic resistance in several bacteria. In this paper, they did not discuss this, the result in the way that glyphosate was an antibiotic, but they were explaining the story by the fact that, in fact, the process of the emergence of this antibiotic resistance was due to the fact that the processes, the biological processes to deal with the glyphosate was similar to the processes to deal with antibiotic. So, in fact, it was a pump. This pump was pumping out the glyphosate from the cells, but they were not at any point of the discussion referring to the fact that glyphosate was an antibiotic. So, voilà. But it's what I can say on this. But I've never seen this patent. But okay, I got it now. So okay. Now you have seen it. Yeah, I've seen it. So if it's registered as a patent, I would say as an antibiotic, I would say this can be this raised the question of antibiotic resistant emergence, and this is also the same for the use of veterinary antibiotics. So, for example, at the moment I've got a big project on that, in which we are studying the emergence of antibiotic resistance to veterinary antibiotics that are that can be found in the soil or in the water, in wastewater notably. And so, okay, I will stop here. So.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. So, personally, I've never worked on antibiotics, and I've never studied the impact of antibiotic on earthworms or other soil organism. But I know that, for instance, in the context of organic waste, the use of organic wastes, there is an important question. There are some antibiotics in the context of pesticides as well. So we know that I know that there is not a lot of scientific literature on the effect of antibiotics on soil fauna. And what is funny is that when I read the book of Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring, I found a piece of an article from a newspaper from in the 60s, and the antibiotics were considered as emergent contaminants, as they still are. They are still considered as emergent contaminants. So I think we have many questions to answer concerning antibiotics.
Okay, let's widen it out. The floor has had its say. Over to you. Your name, rank, serial number, those kind of things.
So I'm Paul Leonard. I work for BASF, and by the way, we're members of the IBMA as well. So I had first of all clarification, because I think if I understood you correctly, Mr. Potts, you were talking about the ecotoxicology in soil organisms because, of course, the ecotoxicology dossier for plant protection products is extensive. It covers thousands of pages and a wide range of organisms. And many of my good colleagues, I have 100 colleagues working purely on ecotox dossiers in Limburgerhof, and as many, again, in outside organisations. This is probably the most challenging part of any dossier that's used to support a crop protection product. So I'd hate anybody to leave this room with the misapprehension that we don't need ecotoxicology data to approve crop protection products. It's absolutely at the heart of the dossier. And I'm very happy to explain that, or put you in touch with my expert colleagues if you'd like to find out more about it. But I had a question as well, which is to Celine Rolossi. Have you looked at or compared the impact of the pesticides that you looked at in soil on earthworm behaviour with the effects of, for example, deep furrow ploughing? I recently visited the Game Conservancy Council in the UK, and I was really surprised to see that in one study they showed me it took 6 years for earthworm burrow densities to return to normal pre-ploughing levels following deep furrow ploughing.
Sorry. Yeah. So there are lots of articles on the effect of ploughing on earthworms, and it's a huge impact. So because there are mechanical damages and many different effects. So after when you stop ploughing, you can have a quite fast recovery of earthworms. After 2 or 3 years, you can have a community that increase. It's a little bit different after pesticides because of the remaining molecules in the soil. And we noticed in one study I conducted that we need more than 10 years to recover the community, for some species to come back to the fields and for the population dynamics to be good.
The regulation requires recovery within 1 year, or you can't register the product in terms of field evidence. If you have an impact on earthworms after 1 year, you can't register the product based on field trial evidence.
Yes, but in the regulation, I think that is just one molecule. And so in the field, it's different because if you have some impact of one chemical on earthworm community, you will have other molecules probably used the same year on the same crop. So the recovery could be more difficult than if you just have one application of one chemical.
Sir. Yeah, my name is Piet Bodenkamp from Artemis, Netherlands, the Dutch IBMA. I have a similar question. You did a lot of studies with PPP on DNA, cell and population level of earthworms. And I wonder if you stop really with applying in your experiments, how soon will the recovery be? Or did you never did those studies?
If I study the recovery myself?
Yeah, the recovery, just stopping with applying, and you monitor the fields again, and do it come back to a normal level, and how long does it take?
In fact, we have a semi-field condition trial, because we worked in a fallow that has not received any pesticide for more than 20 years. And we test an organic and an inorganic, copper-made pesticide, and an organic pesticide. And we follow the community after 1 month, 6 months, 12, 18, and 24 months. So we had a big effect of one pesticide. And we are assessing the recovery. And we noticed that some pesticides have effects after more than 12 months.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And there are some effects as well on functions, because we are assessing soil functionings in terms of organic matter degradation and soil structure. And so we will see if we have effects, but I think that because we lost big earthworms and we had some effect after 12 months, so we will see if we have some effects on the macroporosity that is done by these earthworms. And we also followed the community in a trial that stopped using pesticide in 1998. And we made some samples after 10 years of differentiation of the systems. And we couldn't see any difference between the conventional system and the organic system after 10 years. And I came back when I was hired in Versailles, and after 15 years, it was totally different. Because I don't know why exactly, but my feeling is that, and it's published, it's because there are a remnants of persistence of some pesticides, because in 1998 some pesticides were quite harmful for soil organisms, and the frequency was not the same. They were used more, and as well the rotation has changed. So probably with more legumes, there were more legumes in the rotation. So it's not just about pesticides, it's all the cropping system that was changed. But some species came back in the fields, and we couldn't see them after 10 years of differentiation, just after 15 years. So it's long. I think that when you stop using pesticides, quite long, to recover the community. You're welcome.
I'll take another couple of questions if they're necessary. Yes, please. And I'm just going to give about 5 more minutes on this, and then I'm moving on to the next subject. So short and sharp, no speeches, please.
I have a very sharp question. I'm representing a Polish magazine about health and allergies. I would like to address the question because we were discussing about earthworms, about losing microorganisms and also losing biodiversity. But what about health consequences, that people are missing microelements, also nutrition, because the soil is getting weaker and weaker. And those are financial consequences also about making research and all those I would say checkups that has to be done. It's very costly. Who will cover the cost of, let's say, reversing the pesticides consequences? And shouldn't this be like in Sweden, that pesticides usage is very highly taxed, and then farmers are very financially motivated to use biopesticides? Is this a solution?
Anybody want to take that?
Luca.
That's a suive, as we say, when we don't understand what the answer is. But I think I take your point that if there are effects, who pays the effects? Let me ask for other comments, other questions. Yeah.
Evelyn Underwood, Institute for European Environmental Policy. First question for the JRC. I know that in 2013 you published a first attempt to estimate the status of soil biodiversity in Europe using a sort of expert scoring approach and then mapping indirect proxies. I'd be interested to know if you're going to make any further attempts in that direction, if you are thinking of any other approaches. And then for Claudia Pelosi, I don't know if this is something you know about, but I'd be interested in whether you see a potential in the kind of citizen science approach of asking people to dig a hole and look at the earthworms and count how many blue ones there are and green ones and so on. Is that a feasible way of assessing impacts on soil biodiversity? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, indeed, in 2011 we were still stuck with estimates and guesstimates. But what we have decided is that in the next, actually this year's Lucas Soil Survey, we will have a real field observation consistently all over EU of soil biodiversity. What we will do is we have already financed and put it into the program that in the 2018 survey will include measurements on what was just presented on metagenomics of soil, so that we will have DNA extraction and measurements consistently on soils collected over the 28 member states. And this maybe will allow us for the first time to have, as I was saying, a reality check on what is the status across the EU on soil biodiversity. Because as you rightly mentioned, the difficulty is always to get consistent data and to get away from estimates, guesstimates and perceptions and go to actual measurements and be able to make a statement about the state of soil biodiversity in Europe based on actual observations. But this will be done this year. Of course, the result will not come out this year because this year we do the sampling and then the analysis. I suspect you will get a final answer probably end of 2019 where we will release the results of the 2018 survey.
Yes, it's already done. In France, there is an initiative coming from Brittany to involve the people in the assessment of earthworms in the different types of ecosystems. So for farmers in the field or for everybody in their garden. So they use mustard and they just dig. Just to assess if they... So there is a big database now gathering all these results, but sometimes it's tricky because we can ask some question about the relevancy of the results because the methodology must be the same and sometimes it's not done the same way. Okay,
I want to ask one last question myself, and that is to bring you back to the reality of our arable farming in Europe. Our arable farming in Europe, as I said, takes up about half the land, more or less, and is continuous, so it takes place year upon year upon year. Now, in the experimental work that you've described, of course you're dealing with 1 year, but the reality of agriculture is continuous use. It's been there for forever, I guess. And we also know that, I think from your work, Luca, many years ago, that soil organic content in European arable soils is quite considerably lower than that in other soils. We know some of the reasons. But is there a way of making a link between the reality of the way we farm and the reality of what that entails and what appears, at least from what you've said, I think, to be a weakening of the dynamic of soil in terms of its ability to retain organic matter, in its ability to retain a good structure, in its ability to absorb water, all those things that everybody knows and I forget. Each one of you, 30 seconds. You.
Yeah, well, you know I love reality, so for sure a reality check would be very interesting. The big question to me is if you want to keep your soils alive, you need to take care of the life in soil. Now, of course, as you say, the agriculture has always been based on plowing, on certain practices that are well established and are well functioning. But if you look for alternatives, then you must be sure that you don't have trade-offs on other sides. So I'm not completely sure that many of the other alternative methods will bring benefits. But as you say, there is definitely a lower soil organic carbon level in European soils due to mineralization of carbon due to soil disturbance. There are many advocates for alternative methods, zero tillage, reduced tillage. There are many things you can do. But again, I would really like to somehow get first a full assessment of where are we with soil biodiversity. And once we will have data that will show that it's exactly there where we probably have more intensive agriculture, that we have less, then maybe we can draw some conclusions. I'm not prepared really to say more than that. But certainly, I'm convinced that we need to keep the soils alive, not only because it's nice, but also because they perform functions, the carbon cycle, but also the nitrate cycle. There are many things that are fundamental to keep alive. But you can do farming on sterile materials if you want. but it's not really, I think, what people would be very keen to hear.
Okay.
Yes. What I said at one point of my talk is that we need to have normal operating range, and I think that this is really the truth. So we need to have more data to establish this normal operating range on various bioindicators that can be used as proxies of soil functioning. And somehow we have to establish values for, I would not say each soil type, but I will say a range of soil types in which we can have values like for your blood analysis, for example, saying that, okay, this value is okay, you can maybe grow wheat and apply this pesticide without any problem, or don't apply this pesticide because the value is too low and you have to go for biocontrol, for example. So we have to have more data and establish this normal operating range to have a kind of monitoring program to help the farmers to decide on which crop to go and how to organize their farming procedures.
The last point, the earthworms, as it were.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say that we need in natura data, as my colleagues. I think it's very important to know what happened in the field, considering not only pesticide, but all the whole cropping systems, and not just one practice or another one. And so we need biomonitoring procedures. I think that one solution could be to assess the pesticides' potential effect would be to study the fate and the exposure of living organisms. So because it's very difficult to assess the effects properly in the field because of different factors interacting at the same time, I think exposure could be a good way to have an idea of the potential effects.
Okay, let's finish at that. I want to thank the three speakers. Pavel first.
Yeah, I would like also to thank to the speakers, and I have to apologize because I have another commitment, so I hope to be back at the last panel, and now I have to go, so I'm not abandoning you, I'm leaving you only.
Okay, we expect you back. I want to thank the three speakers. I want you to thank the three speakers. They have opened up, I think, for me, the crucial element in relation to the baseline for IPM. For me, they've opened up a new vision of the challenges that we face. I readily admit that caution and the need for more research were not far behind what they said, but researchers say those kind of things. People in the policy world have to sometimes do other things. So thank you very much, and could I ask the next group of speakers to come to the floor? Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. This is my victory.
I see you, dear.
Yeah.
How are you doing?
Hey, Tassel, how are you? You're the next group after this. You're not this one.
Ah,
you're not this one.
Who's the next one?
No, you're the next one. You're the last group.
And what do they have now?
Two farmers.
Ah.
So you should be listening to farmers. How are you? I'll talk to you after. How are you? Oh, there's the next one. Yeah. Okay. You guys have spread a bit. That's good. And, who are we going to start with?
Allora, facciamo prima.
I'll see you in a few minutes. Yeah. Okay. I'm perfect.
Michael, it might be that I won't be able to do it.
Okay.
If it's case, just say hello.
I understand. Okay. You're the main man.
Oui, je suis le...
L'homme le plus important pour l'instant. Okay, ça va? Okay. Let's let those people who are about to have their coffee, but the rest of us, we're back in business again. And we're going to the second session. We've dealt with soil. We haven't answered problems, but we've dealt with it. And we now move to the challenge, if you get soil right, of mainstreaming IPM into arable farming. And what can be done now. And the approach that the organisers have taken is to get two producers to give us their experiences. One producer from France, the other producer from Italy. Both of them are playing rugby at the weekend, but so is my country, so I'm not taking sides for either of them. So let's start, nevertheless, with La Belle France, because France plays Ireland on Saturday. So it's up to you. You've got about 15 minutes or so. I'm not going to be too strict, but nevertheless, I expect to score a couple of tries against you. Off you go. This is Jean-Bernard Lausier.
Merci. Malheureusement, je pense que vous allez gagner contre nous samedi, oui. Mais c'est pas grave. On fera mieux l'année prochaine. Donc bonjour. Donc je suis Jean-Bernard Lausier. Je suis agriculteur en France, au sud de la Normandie, à 100 km à l'ouest de Paris. Sur un plateau céréalier type bassin parisien. C'est un plateau de limon moyen, on va dire, avec un potentiel de rendement en blé de 80 quintaux.
With potential yield of, well, the climate is an oceanic one. We have about 600 millimeters of rain per year. There was a drought in June, that was a problem, but nonetheless, we have about 600 millimeters per year. The landscape is a semi-open plateau, it's open fields, but there are groves and copses here and there. The land that I cultivate is on this plateau in the basin. There's a problem of water pollution. I began working in 1990 and I set up on my family farm. It was 40 hectares space, and today I cultivate 80 hectares. I did have a poultry farm as well, but I gave up that activity and passed it on to another member of the family. The first years from 1980 to 1987, we were just setting up, and we didn't try to do anything too extravagant. We did as more or less everybody was doing. We had a classic system for this region. We had a 3-year rotation with rapeseed, barley and wheat. These are the different cultures we had, and on the edges there was some protein crops and peas, but that was really on the margins. I've always been very environmentally aware, and right from the beginning, unfortunately, the economic issues were perhaps more important and greater than the environmental concerns I had. But in 1987, the wheat costs were not very high, but I was already doing okay. And so I decided to use a simplified technical system. And we could call this the beginnings of what in France is called a conservation agriculture. That is a kind of agriculture where we try not to affect the soil too much and not change the topsoil very much. My priorities were to reduce the workload as well and stop this kind of ploughing that, as we've heard, kills earthworms and is bad for the environment. This ploughing had a very negative impact on the ecosystem in the soils. The problem was that at the end of, after 3 years, having not changed anything other than the work on the soil, I realized that I would have a major problem with weed management. What's more, through the non-tilling, I had become very dependent on glyphosate. And then already at that time, I wasn't very happy to have a production system that was actually dependent on glyphosate. If I didn't have glyphosate at that time, then my whole system would collapse. And then, as I said, I had this big problem of managing the weeds as well. So in France and perhaps in Europe as well, land use contracts were introduced at this time. And this was some kind of commitment from the farmer to use better environmentally friendly practices. And through that, we got major financial incentives as well. And so I said, this is a solution perhaps. Perhaps I can combine my economic needs and my environmental concerns and come up with a sustainable system. So at the same time, in the region where I live, in the Earth, a group was set up. It was a group of farmers who wanted to work together and implement IPM and the principles of integrated farming. And so this was a brilliant opportunity for me. I could get involved here and get the economic benefits, the environmental ones, and work as part of a group as well. So we began our work then. What was really important at that stage was working as a team. I need to stress that because it allowed us to develop new practices, and working as a group is really fundamental. Farmers, we're often on our own in tractors. We may be able to put the radio on and listen to some music, but we are on our own when we're doing a lot of our work. And so when you come together, you can exchange much more and make more progress and do it more quickly. So since the year 2000, we've gone from strength to strength. We've developed all of these notions of integrated agriculture. They weren't really used in practice at the time, and I think we really started people off using these techniques. And so we had integrated wheat, and now looking back on that, I say, well, that's ridiculous. You can't only have integrated wheat. You need to do more. And we quickly saw that we needed to work at the system level, the whole farm level. And so we decided to implement some strategies for weed management, for disease and pest management as well. The first thing we had to alter were the rotations. That's really fundamental. We had to extend the rotations. We needed new cultures to be introduced. That disrupted the diseases and the spread of pests. And so this long rotation also involved greater diversity of crops between spring and winter as well. Before I said I worked with rapeseed, wheat and barley, but now I use much more. I have those 3 crops, but we also have linseed, we have spring barley, we have spring peas, wheat still, because that's something that was very complicated for me. I grew up as a wheat farmer. There was a time when some farmers only grew wheat, and so I couldn't completely abandon this one crop. But so here again, working as a team was very useful for me because it helped me to get my ideas straight on this point too. So we had a different crops in spring and in winter. And we worked at the system level. We didn't only want to think from one year to the next and from one culture to the next, but really to manage the whole system. And what I mean by that is being more flexible when it comes to weed management. And you can do that on a specific crop like wheat. If you know that next you're going to have a different crop which is less affected by these weeds. And so you'll be able to make up a loss from one with another crop. So it's this reasoning that looks at the whole system, and it takes into account all different factors. Then we've got all sorts of related techniques that are part of this. The dates of sowing, of the different seeds. When I say that dates of sowing, what I mean is, for instance, with wheat. Wheat's always generally sown from the 1st of October to the 15th of October. Sorry, the 20th of September to the 15th of October. And that's for various reasons. And, for example, hunting starts on the 15th of October, and so farmers need to finish their work before then. It's also for security reasons. The weather is better for sowing at that time of year, and you can do it much quicker. But nonetheless, at the start of October, weeds like Vulparagra start growing as well, and it's important. Well, and when we look back, we can keep growing until the 10th of November. And so once we change the sowing dates, we can really affect the weeds as well. So you can avoid all sorts of weeds from growing if you just change the time of sowing. We also use this technique of false sowing. Don't get me wrong, we do plant a seed, but actually what we're doing isn't planting a crop, we're planting something else. And as you can see, this isn't chemistry. In chemistry you have a product and it either works or it doesn't work anymore. You put it on the market and that's the end of it. That's not true anymore. You've got these different techniques and you have to combine them. It's a whole jigsaw puzzle that you put together to make the system. As regards the disease and pests, the same thing was true here. I use different varieties of wheat. I've got 5, 6, 7 different ones, and they are complementary as regards their disease resistance, the ways that they grow. Some have bigger leaves, so they'll grow higher, and so on. They use all the space, And so this means that there's a lower threat from predators and diseases. This is also something that's changing on an ongoing basis. What I'm doing today is what I was doing yesterday, but with new techniques, and it will change tomorrow and in the years to come. It's constantly changing. For instance, if you take rapeseed, for 3 years now, I sow this with intercrops. I sow that with clover and other intercrops. And the idea is to cover the soil as much as possible. This year we saw that this actually confuses some of the pests and the predators, and they don't know where the plant is, and it means that I have a lower need for mineral nitrogen. When the plants bloom, then you have a frost and they freeze and they fall off, and then the rapeseed replaces those plants. And when you have the rapeseed harvest, then there it goes, and then it's the turn of the clover, and it really explodes, and it produces nitrogen, and so it's all great for the system as a whole. I mean, it sounds simple when I put it like this, and not everything ends in success, but I won't go into the details of things that didn't work so well. But there's a lot here that's very positive. As regards sustainability, we see that the targets for sustainability that we had in 2008, 2010, we can compare them with 2013 and 2015. The slide is perhaps a bit complicated, but basically my sustainability objectives are the same. And I have fulfilled the contract that I had with myself. That was about sustainability, both social sustainability, economic and environmental sustainability. And often I say my priority is to free up my time. I've got more free time now. I have spread out my working time. I've also shown that with my 80-hectare farm, it's quite a small one perhaps. Other ones are a bit bigger, 120 hectares and so on. But I've shown that even with a farm of my size, it's completely viable. And it was important for me to show that to my colleagues. I showed that you don't need hundreds and hundreds of hectares to be sustainable. Lots of my colleagues now tell me that actually I'm quite lucky to have a small farm. And I say that's not a difficult thing to resolve, but I've also able to make a living from my farm, and it's enough for me. I'm able to meet my environmental objectives, and I meet the challenges of the land where I farm. I'm able to reduce the use of phytosanitary products and plant protection products, so I think I'm going in the right direction here. In economic terms, I have results that are comparable to the results that my colleagues have. We can look here at the intensity of treatments. This means herbicides and others you've got, the average is over 5 here, and then if you look at the DEFI region, it's at between 5 and 5.5. In our group, we're much lower than that. We're at 2.5 for the group that I'm part of, and me, well, I'm showing you my data because I'm the one who's come to talk to you today. I'm doing slightly better than the rest of the group. But as you can see, as a whole, we've really reduced the IFT levels compared to the region. This covers its degree of diversity, because if you exclude herbicides from IFT, well, that's no problem for me. I got to 0.5, 0.6, which is a very low level. But the problem is when you have herbicides included in that figure, then it goes a bit higher. For the management of weeds, you need the herbicides more. Look, this here shows the economic results. You can compare the figures from farms in the region where I operate. And this also includes my farm. If this shows the operational costs, and mine are much lower than the average. And then if you look at the gross margins, and yes, my production is slightly lower. It's perhaps a 5% lower production on average. And sometimes that goes up to 8%. But because the operational costs are much lower, the economic margins at the end of the day are about the same. I was saying before that this is a system approach. Which means that because I have a lot of cultures, my work is spread out across the year. But this means that I don't need huge amounts of equipment because I always have enough time to do the work that I have to do. Even if in principle I do like to have free time. So I don't have much material, I don't need high power equipment, I don't need 3 or 4 tractors, I've got just one. And it means that in terms of operating costs, they're lower than other farms as well. But there are problems as well and difficulties. Weed management is a real difficulty. The current issues surrounding glyphosate is another point. I haven't ploughed for many years now, but I was also careful not to use very much glyphosate. I tried to avoid using it or use very little. And it was quite difficult to do that. And eventually I said that I would have to probably go back to using it. And now, 2 years ago, I decided I had to start ploughing again. I do it in winter for the spring crops. That allows me to destroy the intermediary crops more easily and manage the weed issue in spring because it's only working on the topsoil, and without glyphosate and without tilling, I wouldn't have been able to do my work. So I think you have to be flexible here. You can't be too dogmatic. My only objective is to reduce the number of external chemicals, plant protection products, and fertilizers being used. That's my main goal, and I'm doing everything I can to reach that objective. I've now got biodiversity fields and flowers in my fields, and my colleagues ask me, why are you doing that? I've also got some beehives, and my bees are happy, so I care more about my bees than what my colleagues have to say. So things are always going to keep changing, and if I come back here in 5 years, I'm sure I won't tell you the same things, but my goals will always be the same. That's to lower my dependency as far as possible on plant protection products, fertilizers, and other chemical products. And I hope I'm going in the right direction. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. IPM in practice. And let's go to Leonardo Moscariti. You have to do the same.
Grazie per l'invito. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. Good afternoon. My name is Leonardo Moscaritolo. I'm coming from the Basilicata region of southern Italy. I run the family business. It's a cereals business. And in my area, we've always grown cereals. And in fact, we are sort of the grain centre of Italy, in fact. And due to the fact that brewing, artisanal brewing has really taken off in Italy, we have actually started growing durum wheat. And that is actually, and barley, and that has actually enabled us to open up to new markets. And we've been able to do that quite successfully. Over the last 4 years, I have been the national coordinator of the cereals board. And working together with colleagues throughout the country, we address yield issues. And us farmers, in the past, over many years, we have produced a series of different cereals, and that has meant that there's been soil erosion, that the quality of the soil has been reduced because there's actually been no crop rotation, and we've been using the same active processes. Now, since we made the change, the situation has got a lot better. And in my company, over the last few years, we've started experimenting with new techniques with a view to solving the serious problems that we were facing. I set myself some rules, defined clear methods, and set costs with a view to a certain level of production. So we started off well. We went through the planning stage, and we started at the sowing stage. And we looked at the different varieties that, of course, need to be addressed because we had problems with certain funguses. We carried out checks, and we also looked at the different apparatus that was used for sowing the seeds, because we wanted to try and avoid any damage to the environment. And also we had health and safety concerns for our workers as well. In terms of managing our work, we're very attentive to rotation issues. Now, our French colleague was saying that after years of just having a single crop, now we have a 3-year rotation system. But I've actually moved on to a 5-year or even 6-year rotation system with many different types of barley and cereals and protein crops as well. So my aim here today is to try and share my experience with you in terms of dealing with pests and whilst trying to use as little pesticide as possible. Now, as I was saying before, after preparing my seeds, I actually engage in setting up a false seed bed, and that enables me to use certain machines and set the sowing at a certain date. 25th of October, say. Just as an indicative date. Now, of course, for the ground to be ready, well, I have to wait for it to be ready before I sow. I have to wait for the autumn rains to arrive. And if necessary, I can even put back the sowing up to 20 days. And then, in the middle of November, we deal with any of the weeds that have emerged, and then we decide whether it's actually time to sow or not, or whether we should sow late. Over the last few days, I have opted to actually delay the sowing with a view to trying to reduce the number of weeds to a bare minimum. And so actually, in early December, we actually entered into the sowing stage. We have a new sowing equipment, and therefore we're using new techniques. Now, for sowing cereals, you have furrows, but we were having gaps of between 12 and 20 centimetres between the seeds, and that means that there's less interference from the weeds. Because we need to make sure that the weeds are not able to actually make use of the sun and of the water that's in the soil. What I have been doing with the support of CREA, one of the largest agricultural research bodies in Italy, consists of using a new sowing machine which actually regulates the distance. It's a very reduced distance. It's about 5 centimetres, in fact, as opposed to the 15 or 20 centimetres that we were using in the past. The new method doesn't actually it actually changes the way in which sowing takes place. Unlike the traditional system, it means that now we make sure that the seed gets to the correct depth. We optimise the available space in terms of light, water and nutrients. And that enables us to limit the growth of weeds. What about the results that we've obtained? Well, it shows that the new system is successful. There's no reduction in quantity, but there's an increase in quality. We end up with a better final product, and we can actually use more competitiveness, actually more competitive cereal. And we can also actually reduce the sowing dose. And this is more in line with the EU policy, and it also is more economically viable. This is the practice which I'm perfectly satisfied with. Using greater precision, I think that is the way forward. There are other practices that I have adopted, but have not always borne fruit. There was other machines that I was using to till the ground and remove weeds that had just emerged. In cases where you have the roots that have actually taken root, and if you're quick, you were able to actually remove them. However, such activities have not always been sufficiently successful, because you actually need the ground to be dry and not damp, and that of course is not always possible during the winter months. In terms of humidity and climate, in the south of Italy we have never actually had problems that have emerged elsewhere, because we've always had a dry climate and a well-ventilated climate. So we haven't had any problems with mycotoxins. Only in the last couple of years, with higher temperatures and spring rains, have we actually needed to use fungicide. And that is why we try to really optimise our choices in terms of dealing with this particular pest. So these new methods and new techniques have seen an economic benefit for us because it's reduced production costs and it's also reduced the use of pesticides by at least 50%. I think we all need to do our bit to save the environment, to ensure environmental sustainability, and we also need to harness all of the benefits that science makes available to us. Thank you very much.
So, we've had 2 practical farm experiences, and from my perspective, very positive experience, and I thank the 2 of you very much. We've got 3 other speakers here. Their job is to help you. Now, let me put that to each one of them. Your contribution in the 5 minutes that you each have, how do you help these 2 gentlemen and other ladies to have IPM in arable farming? And we'll start with you, Everett Hamblock from the Coppert group.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I will first very quickly give you an impression of our founder and the company, where we found the spirit to provide solutions for a more sustainable agriculture. So back in 1967, Jan Coppert was a dedicated cucumber grower. Diseases and pests were controlled with chemicals, but the efficacy of this method decreased every year. Jan Coppert became allergic and ill as a result of these products. He had to look for an alternative and immersed himself in a world of natural enemies, without Google, without Wikipedia, WhatsApp, or the Sustainable Use Directive. He was the first to introduce a natural enemy to combat spider mite infestations. Since then, the search for biological solutions have expanded. Coppert solutions are applied in over 130 countries. Coppert produces sustainable cultivation solutions for food crops and ornamental plants. Together with growers and in partnership with nature, we work to make agriculture and horticulture healthier, safer, more productive and resilient. We firmly believe in the power of nature. Working with nature leads to a holistic approach, which makes the cultivation of food crops environmental friendly and free of chemical residue. One of the examples of the power is Pseudomonas chlorophyllus. It's a gram-negative soil bacterium used as a seed treatment for the control of seed-borne fungal diseases. It can be applied to cereals, including wheat, rye, barley, oats, but also vegetables, including carrot and peas. The Pseudomonas strain is one of the oldest biocontrol agents used in Europe. The application for the inclusion in Annex 1 goes back to 1994 in Sweden. Since that time, we have new registrations across Europe, going from the north, Finland, Sweden, down to the south, over Denmark, Germany, France, and Spain. The total amount of Pseudomonas products sold within Europe goes about 4,100,000 liters, corresponding to about 35,000 square kilometers. Assuming that the dosage for chemical treatment is about 1/3 of the Pseudomonas products, we believe that about 1,350,000 liters of chemical fungicides have been substituted by this product. No single adverse occasion has been reported over the years, not even on earthworms. We are in the middle, or actually at the end, of a very difficult renewal process as we speak, and this product could disappear from the European market, mainly due to regulatory and procedural issues. We believe that biology has to be treated as it should and not as chemicals. We bring life. We have natural solutions available for growers like these to rebuild ecosystems globally. Thank you.
Thank you. You've got some information there. I have a little point that maybe Paola would think about, and that is every year I get the flu vaccine, and every year there's a total change from the previous one, and everything seems to be registered within about 6 months. Does that mean anything in this conversation? Let me go to the second speaker. Again, your job is to help these gentlemen and other gentlemen and ladies in their route to IPM, and this is Elisa, Bison, Heinicke from Biocare. Where you go?
Thank you very much. As you said, I'm from Biocare. Thank you. We are a small company in the heart of Germany, and we produce biological plant protection products. So if you eat potatoes, corn, or pepper, there's a good chance that in some part of the supply chain you will find our products. For example, in corn, there's the corn borer. It's a very important pest. The larvae feed through the entire maize plant and cause enormous yield loss and also mycotoxin occurrence, which is very dangerous for human and animal health. We propagate and sell the beneficial Trichogramma wasp. It parasitizes the eggs of the corn borer, so the larvae don't hatch anymore. The application of Trichogramma has a very good efficacy of 80%. But of course, it's not as easy as conventional pesticides. You need an exact monitoring of when the corn borer flies, because if the Trichogramma is applied too late, the larvae of the corn borer have already hatched and there's no effect. In some countries, there's already a good monitoring system in place by the official consultation offices and the distributors. But in some other countries, we are still building this system. So in general, a more extended network of official consultation of consultants would help us and the new biological solutions to be implemented successfully. However, the farmer doesn't only need from us from our products to be effective, they also need to be cost efficient. My father has started our company over 20 years ago and has made it possible through working with the farmers, through innovative production lines and small margins that's possible in SMEs to now offer Trichogramma as for the same price as alternative conventional pesticides. And if you also add a little fun to your products, there's a good chance farmers are very happy to switch to biologicals. For a few years now, Trichogramma can be applied with drones. For larger corn areas, we are right now developing a light still tractor for our bow thrower who can apply up to 300 hectares of Trichogramma capsules per day. Oh, yeah. So let's come to potato production. Wireworms is a very important pest. It feeds through the tubers and diminishes the quality. In cooperation with the University of Göttingen and Bielefeld, and partly funded by the German government, we have developed the granulate attercap. It attracts the wireworms by emitting CO2 and kills them by infecting the wireworms with the Mytarrhizium bruneum, which goes out of our capsules. But there are around 10 different wireworm species in the field, and we control them with one species, with one Mytarrhizium bruneum. And so it really depends on the wireworm species that are in the field how effective attercap is. So we need to start thinking about having more than one active substances in our product to offer the farmer reliable and effective solutions. In contrast to Trichogramma, for attercap we need a registration. It's a pesticide, and which costs around €1 million. And the investment in the production line and development of the product is at least another €1 million. And we are right now in the lucky situation that we were able to obtain an emergency registration. So we are already allowed to produce and sell, at our CAP, and so we already have an income. The registration process can take up to 5 years. So usually we would have advance payments of 2 million euros and no income. And this might have been financially too risky for us as a small company. In general, there are less and less pesticides available for the farmer, and we quickly need to offer them new solutions and alternative solutions. We are working with low-risk biological antagonists, and there could be many more solutions available. But the introduction of these products into the market is delayed and sometimes even impeded by the high cost and long duration of the registration process, especially for us small and medium companies, which have the interest in small niche markets and most importantly have the interest and the drive to quickly transform this pesticide market. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you very much. You guys have all been to business school. You know this 5-minute rule fairly well. Let's go to Paolo. You have university. So what's the university going to do for these gentlemen? There's a few questions are building up for DG Sante, but we'll leave DG Sante mind its own questions. What are you going to do for the farmers?
Okay, may I have the... Yes. Thanks a lot. So thank you and good afternoon, everyone. So when I got the invitation to this nice event, I thought that rather than showing you complicated scientific theories or graphs, I'd rather tell you a story. I think it's a nice story. It's a success story. And although it is from 20 years ago, I think it is timely to represent it now, basically for two reasons. The first one is that it's a story, it's a system that was developed together with farmers. And I think that we need more research done not for farmers but with farmers. And the second reason is that it is representative of an approach which I think might and should become more and more important in European agriculture. So actually what I'm talking about is this system. So you see a picture there. This is a system developed in a large organic farm, 420 hectares, at least for my country, it's a large size type of farm. In the arable part of the farm, the system was pretty simple at the beginning. So the farmer was growing 1 year durum wheat and the next year sunflower. So after discussing with the farmer, we decided to change the wheat part of the system into what you see here in this picture, which is basically a combination of durum wheat and a clover. Subterranean clover is an annual clover. I will come back to this because the features of this clover are key for the success of this system. You can see from this picture that you have 2 rows of wheat followed by a 25-centimeter band of clover, broadcast sown, and then another 2 rows of wheat, and then another band, and like this until the end of the field. So the 2 crops are sown together. They grow together for most of their cycle. Then in June, in our environment, is the end of the life cycle of the clover, so the clover naturally dies after producing the seed. And after more or less 1 month, it's time to harvest wheat. Then after harvesting wheat, it's the Mediterranean summer, which is usually dry, and after the summer, we start having some rain. So if you come back to that field, let's say in the next autumn or winter season, you will see something, well, that's okay, basically what I have already anticipated. You will see something like this. What is that? This is the natural regrowth of the clover exploiting the ecological characteristics of this specific species, which is a self-reseeding species. It means that at the end of the cycle, the peduncle bearing the seed is brought down to the soil and the seed is released in the soil. So as soon as you have some rain, you have a natural regrowth of a cover crop, basically. So what is the purpose of having this? So together, the two crops grown together, they cover better the soil. They are complementary because they do not compete neither for light, because one is tall and the other is short, and neither for soil resources, because one, wheat, has a superficial root system and the other, clover, has a taproot. So they explore soil nutrients and soil resources in a better way when they are grown together. And we can exploit here this peculiar characteristic of subclover, obtaining another cover crop in the next autumn and winter season, pay attention, without the need of resowing it, just exploiting the natural characteristics of this species. But that's not the end of the nice part of the story, because in the next winter, when you have the standing stubble of the wheat and this nice cover from the clover, you can bring, for example, if you have sheep, you can bring them to the field to graze. And this was actually the farmer was doing. And he was also renting part of his land to nearby shepherds, so having an extra earnings, just exploiting the characteristics of this system. And then you have sunflower, and you can exploit the last part of the growth of the clover and utilizing it as a green manure crop, providing nitrogen to the next sunflower crop, and thereby reducing the need of applying nitrogen fertilizers. So this is just to show you that you don't need to buy new machines. You just need a couple of adjustments to a classical standard serial driller to set up the system that you will need to sow this crop. And in terms of yield, you have a yield reduction of 10 to 15% compared to the standard system, but don't forget that you are planting 50% less seeds of wheat. And why are you having just a 10 to 15% yield penalty? Because of two reasons. First of all, wheat has more room, so it can produce more tillers, and part of these tillers can bear spikes. Second, because don't forget that you have the clover. So the clover is passing part of the nitrogen to the wheat, therefore sustaining it towards production. Then I mentioned the reduction of fertilizer costs for sunflower. And I can tell you that about 20 years ago, you could rent 1 hectare of your land to nearby shepherds to bring their sheep and let them graze for about €500. So it's an interesting additional source of income to the farmer. This is just quickly to show you that the system was actually working for the weeds, but as you can easily understand, it's not just a system meant to improve with management. It has many other benefits beyond that. I think that the most striking result is this one. The total biomass of the weeds, all the weeds taken together, at the end of the wheat season was 10 grams per meter squared. So maybe this figure doesn't tell you anything, but I can tell you that 10 grams per meter square of total wheat is just a very low amount. And consider that this is in a system which does not use any direct methods, no mechanical control, no chemical control. It's just exploiting the features of the system itself. So I want to conclude with 5 take-home messages briefly. The first one is that the success of integrated weed management, and this is a special case of integrated weed management, is based on diversity and ecological knowledge. We need to diversify our systems. And on top of that, farmers know that diversifying their system also has economic advantages. It can buffer fluctuation in the price of products and other side effects like that. So successful weed management starts from targeted redesign of the crop rotation, and the 2 farmers here have pointed this out very clearly. Third message, there are no silver bullets in integrated weed management. So we need a system approach, and we need to adjust solutions and be ready to change them from time to time. And this is why I think weed management solutions that instead promote homogeneous cropping system cannot work in the long term. And if we just look at what's happening in the US, in the areas where herbicide-resistant crops are used, we see that now those farmers are starting to pay the price of a too simple type of system and a too homogeneous system in terms of herbicide-resistant weeds. Last message, policy instruments are already in place. So we mentioned before the Sustainable Pesticide Directive of 2009. So if we look at Annex 3 of this directive, we already have all the framework we need for the implementation of true IPM. And I think that after 9 years, it's probably time to exploit this opportunity at the very best. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I think the three of you have given clear messages. Now, we've got 5 or 6 minutes for questions and comments. Sir.
Hello. Bonjour. Mon nom est Denis de Froment.
My name is Mr. Dafrange. I work at the European Commission, and I have a question for Mr. Lozier. He pointed out that success in IPM for him came from working as part of a team. He said that was fundamental. I'd like to ask him to explain perhaps why some farmers didn't join the group, or who's in that group. Is it just farmers? Are there private sector or public sector advisors? Are there researchers in that group? And how does this group interact with other actors in the field? Thank you.
Oui, donc.
So this group was an initiative of the agricultural chamber then, and we have one person running it who gives us advice, manages it to a certain extent. This person allows us to meet researchers, other farmers, to experience other techniques. This person has time to see what else is going on in this sector, and that's very important for us. You could ask why there were 20 of us in 2000, and in 2018 there's still 20 of us. Well, that might be our biggest failure. I believe we do need to be patient here. When we started doing this, I saw the little white cars that farmers drive in France, and they were all smiling at each other, but then they stopped in their cars and they started speaking to me. Then they said, what you're doing is good, but I can't do that because my farm is too small, I don't have the right soils. They had all sorts of good reasons for not participating. But what it means is that this idea is in people's minds. It just takes a very long time. I do think it can develop. But I think there needs to be some kind of political impetus as well. In our region, in our département, there are professional organizations. There need to be unions that start looking at this as well. They're active in different professional organizations, and personally, I think there hasn't been much interest to develop in that direction. Maybe I'm mistaken. But when in 2000 we started talking about integrated management, it was niche, but now we don't even say that word. It's become almost a swear word. I don't think there's enough encouragement for farmers to get involved in this, and of course it's more complicated than that, but it is also terribly exciting, and I think they're wrong not to get involved.
Thank you. A question to both farmers. Yes, Martin Dermine from Pan Europe. I don't know how it is in Europe in general, but in several countries there's a problem of depressions in the farming community, that farmers are under pressure. And I wish to know, on the one hand, your job is getting more exciting, but on the other, you take a lot of risks. So I wanted to know how you felt, what impact it had on your own well-being, and if yes, you have now many years of experience, so you don't seem to regret it. But do you think that it's, for most of the farmers, it's a good solution to have a better life?
Okay. Does IPM lead to a better life? Leonardo, tell me.
Sì, sicuramente.
Yes, of course it does. The fact that you have longer rotation, yes, that means you have to diversify. So we have certainly made an improvement in terms of our workload. And then when you're talking about pressure, I'm not sure whether you're talking about bureaucratic pressure being placed on our shoulders, or just pressure more in general.
Yes, or financial pressure. I meant the mortgages farmers can have.
Yes, I understand now. Now, of course, when you look at the market, in Italy at least, up until Christmas, I still had what was left from 2016, and the quality wasn't optimal, so there was a depressed market. But now we actually have no remainders. In 2017 harvest was an excellent harvest in terms of proteins, especially the quality of them. And on the basis of the news I have at my disposal, well, the market should be bouncing back this year, because our mills are actually buying in less from abroad, from Canada, for instance, and that's where we often find the imports coming from in Italy. So we are hopeful. We hope that the market will be back on its feet after a good couple of years of depression.
Thank you.
Je voudrais alors, en termes de
So in terms of risk, who's taking the greatest risk? This notion of risk, well, it depends which way you look at it. The farmer who invests pre-harvest 500, 600 euros per hectare, that's not exactly what you're going to yield, because, well, is he taking less of a risk than me? I'm just investing 200 euros per hectare. Well, I think I'm taking less of a risk. Now, of course, this is a profession we're talking about here. It's a risky profession, but it's risky. Doesn't matter really what choice you take. I'm going to say I'm going to diversify my crops. Maybe if I get a bad wheat harvest, then maybe my corn or another crop might actually do better. So I think I'm actually taking less of a risk here. In terms of well-being, well, you can see me smiling here, can't you? I've got a smile a mile wide. I'm trying to sell my products here, and you know, I ride my bike a lot as well, and I'm very lucky to be such a fervent cyclist. You should all follow in my slipstream. Now, in terms of actually providing agricultural advice, yes, we get a lot of help by the councils in France, these agricultural councils, but you know, they might say, okay, instead of putting 0.4 litre, put to 0.45 litres, 0.5 litres, for instance, that will be better. But should these agricultural councils not also be providing support in another way? Psychological assistance, perhaps? You know, why am I doing what I'm doing? You know, I'm a citizen as well at the end of the day. I think that might be more useful than just knowing whether you should put 0.4 litres or 0.5 litres of a product. When you have the impression that you are actually making a positive contribution to society and the environment, well, you feel better about yourself. You might end up being happier. Who knows?
On that note, we'll bring that to a finish, particularly since we have the replacement for Bernardino, I think, was the last winner of the Tour de France before you. So we have a replacement for Bernard. It's either he or Laurent Fignon, but I think it was Bernardino. But the message was clear. IPM lifts your spirits. And I want to thank Leonardo and I want to thank Jean Bernard for their contribution in lifting spirits. And I want to thank the companies and the University of Art, Elisa and Paolo, for giving the courageous side from their perspective and indicating what's there in terms of help, and for leaving a few questions dangling for the next session. So thank you all very much. We'll have 1 minute while the speakers come up. If you can make a coffee that quick, you'll get a coffee. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. That was wonderful. Et formidable. Vous allez gagner, je crois. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we go back to work. Please, I hope we go back to work. That wasn't very successful.
You put it.
You work on that one. I work on this one.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we go back to work, and this is the third part of the symposium, and we have a discussion, a debate it's called here, but it's a discussion actually, integrating IPM fully into EU policy making and practice. Two directors from the Commission, Tassos Haniotis on my right, who has been involved in the development of agricultural policy for a very long time. I think that's the easiest way to say it. And Paola Colombo from DG Sante, who is responsible for the implementation of the directive on sustainable use. And thereafter then Jutta Gutteland and Karen Kadenbach, both MEPs with a very big interest in this area. So let's get going, and we'll start with you, Tassos.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks for revealing my age. This is the sixth CAP reform or change or whatever you want to call it that I'm presenting in my career from different angles, of course. Now, I don't know how Paula, as a vet, feels, but I as an economist, feel a little bit uneasy with all the scientists in the room. So what I would like to do is put the big policy picture to see and try to give you a sense of where things in the future of common agricultural policy could go and where IPM fits in, because it fits in, theoretically it already fits in, but we need to see how exactly it does right now. Now, there are different ways of addressing the issue that we have about the future of the common agricultural policy right now. I will choose one of possible ways, but any public policy has more or less to answer to four broad questions. The order changes, but normally we should start by the why. We should move into the for whom. We should ask the how, and then we should end up with the how much, because every public policy has a certain money involved. Usually when we discuss about the CAP, we start with the how much. Luckily enough, with the two elephants in the room of Brexit and the future budget out there with all these unknowns, I can skip this. But, of course, it will have implications about what we're going to do. But that's why I believe that the most important thing that we have to ask ourselves is the why of the common agricultural policy. And I presume that most of you, if not all of you, have seen and read the communication. It's under your pillows in the evening, trying to figure out what one line means compared to the other. I put it in a different way here. I changed the order. And the focus here is on the why, on the objectives of the communication, starting with what should be the main driving line of the future of the CAP, which is the strengthening of the environmental and the climate ambition, because this is an urgent task that is coming out from any analysis one could do. The second thing that we have to do is better target the manner in which we provide support, because this is fairer. But fairer is clearly in the eye of the beholder, and we could have another full-day event of discussing about that. I'll skip it completely, keeping only one thing, that part of this targeting doesn't only have to do with income levels, but also has to do with the delivery of the public goods, the elements that I outlined before. Third, we have to rely much more on knowledge, innovation and technology, and this is clearly where your discussion fits in, because it is modern, and not because modern sounds nice, but because agriculture worldwide is facing a major transformation. And in this major transformation, things are happening on the ground. You only heard some of them earlier on, that if the policy doesn't understand, catch up, anticipate future developments, very soon it will become irrelevant. And fourth, this is what has come as the big proposal of the policy. I don't want to underestimate it, but exactly because I want to put it in its proper dimension, is the how we're going to do that, the so-called delivery model. Is the new balance between what we do at the EU level, at the member state level, and at the farm level. And this has the potential to simplify enormously the policy if we do the right things. It has also the potential to go the other way, as with every policy proposal. I will skip very fast the what we intend to do with the communication, identifying that the first thing is we want to stress once more that agriculture is important, and it is important we put there a provision of food, environment, protection, and jobs and growth. But agriculture has a unique characteristic. It's a very small economic sector, 2% of the overall economy, in fact a little bit less, and 4% of employment. It's a sector that covers almost 50% of land, 48% to be exact, and it's a sector that covers 100% of food needs. So the angle from which you see agriculture changes based on which of the statistics you take into account, and all three are correct. We want to consolidate and improve the CAP framework through broad avenues of reflection. Why? Because we were told clearly to be neutral with respect to the future of the budget, so a little bit of the details of what the policies would look like are going to come later on before the summer. And third, we want to prioritize simpler rules and more flexible approaches, because one of the things that we saw with the previous reform, that even the best idea, and greening had very good ideas, could turn out into a bureaucratic nightmare if we don't pay attention to the manner by which the policy is being implemented. By the way, the presentation that I made available and you will get is longer and has slides and other type of, I summarize things here. When we looked so far into what the policy has delivered in its achievements, one thing that is coming out clearly is the CAP has helped improving the EU competitiveness, and that helped the EU turn into a net agro-food exporter, mainly of value-added products. It had a positive impact on jobs and growth in rural areas. We have been talking indirectly with model assumptions of what will happen if the CAP goes out. I invite all of you to look at the World Bank study that was presented in our Agricultural Outlook conference. It's the first time that so much data has been used. It combines economic data and payments data that we provided to them with a very detailed poverty statistics that the World Bank has, and has gone at a nat 3 level and has found out that the CAP is present everywhere with a positive impact on jobs, growth, and the poverty reduction. And what the CAP has done also provides relative income stability. That doesn't mean that the income level is nice, on the contrary, but it means that compared to the other type of volatility, income volatility in other parts of the world that use different types of measures, we have done much better. A simple comparison of EU versus US farm income in recent years gives this picture. But if this is on the plus side, there are some things that are left us wanting. The first thing and shortcomings that comes clearly up front is we need to progress much more on the environmental performance of EU agriculture. That doesn't mean that we haven't made progress. The overall reduction of emissions or fertilizer use are indicative of progress. But if you compare the challenges we face, the objectives we have set for ourselves, and where we are, there is a lot that has to be done. Productivity growth in agriculture is mainly driven by the outflow of labor, which is a natural development and happens everywhere regardless of policy. But we haven't seen much in terms of capital investment or technology, with the exception of what is happening in recent years that has accelerated some events that are interesting. And then we have ongoing discussions of who gets what and the distribution of support that we'll also skip because it's for another discussion. Now, from all the graphs that I had in the presentation, others we have in the background documents, I picked up one that in my view is the most relevant to what is happening with your discussion. This comes from the Munich Reinsurer, and it is climate-linked loss events in recent years at world level. As you see, 2017 is absent, which wasn't a very good year. And if we put January 2018, maybe it could break all records. But whichever way you see it, whether we're dealing with storm events with green, water-related events with blue, and temperature-related events with amber, we have had a dramatic increase in these events, which I'm pretty sure for those of you that are scientists, when you talk about pests and we talk about diseases, they have a very significant impact. And they have an impact that is running much faster usually than the results of research or innovation is spreading to farmers and helping them address it. So when it comes to strengthening the environmental and climate action, what we want to do is set at the EU level very clear wide objectives on air, water, soil and biodiversity. And in all of them, especially in 3 of the 4, integrated pest management fits perfectly in. We want to set a list of available types of intervention that are suitable to achieve these objectives. Give you an example. We mentioned crop rotation. That's one of them. Member States should define the most pertinent schemes and operations that are based on these EU priorities and their specific needs, and farmers then would apply for these schemes with much more flexibility than what they have today. Some have called this renationalization. I remember vividly the time, I was much younger then, when we had one intervention price for wheat that was very high, very different yields from 2 to 10 tons per hectare, very different national prices, very different transport costs. Nobody bothered to say that the CAP was renationalized. Nobody bothered to say that the CAP was renationalized when we had 7 beef premia, and I think that you remember very well. Now we have a debate on renationalization. Let's be clear, renationalization is not allowing flexibility at the member state or at the farm level to address EU-wide objectives. Renationalization would be if we allow member states to do whatever they want and forget EU-wide objectives. So the first real test that we're going to have, may I saw you had it before, this is a gift that Michael has, and said Global Soil Biodiversity Atlas. It's by our JRC colleagues. It also has a biodiversity map of the European Union. Our colleagues in JRC also present a map of soil erosion, of water challenges, biodiversity, I mentioned that before, and emission challenges. Will this be the starting basis for member states to develop their strategy plans and then have the relevant and necessary flexibility to adapt locally and regionally what they have to do or not? And this is one extremely crucial test that, in my view, we have to pass if, in the future, the policy sticks to its EU-wide objectives. But it has to be clear that, based on what we've seen, we have to simplify the manner by what we do. On the better targeting, those of you that like the 80-20% debate, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it today, not because I don't want to, but because we don't have the time, but you have and you have much more slides and details about the distribution of support. What I want to focus on is this reliance on knowledge, innovation, and technology. And I mentioned before, I used the term modern for that, because we have also some internal and external debates, and do people understand this or not? In 5 years' time, can we imagine that there are going to be farmers that will not have smartphones full of applications? What is interesting to note is that whether they have smartphones or tablets full of applications, the first question is how many of these applications are pertinent and will be pertinent to their farming activity. The second thing that we need to know is that most probably there are either going to be US-made, Chinese, or Korean. Yet the satellite images that will go to these applications for free are all European. And this is one of the few areas where Europe right now is at the technological frontier. Are we going to use this information to allow practices like IPM to be introduced in a flexible manner in the policy and help both member states to better achieve their national part of the EU objective, and farmers have the potential to use flexibly the tools they want or not? To be able to do that, we have to look at the gaps that have emerged in terms of those that use and don't use this technology, with respect to those that have the knowledge and don't have this knowledge, and also the perceptions about science. And I will mention 2 things here. For things like that to work, the first thing that we have to do is functioning farm advisory systems. This is not only a legal obligation, it is, but it has to be a reality, because that's another area where Europe is at the scientific frontier, because we do have the scientists that could do this. Do we have at all the member states the capacity to take the knowledge that they generate, look at the innovation partnerships that exist, and transfer this knowledge to the ones that need it? Second thing, in the perceptions of science. We've seen all sorts of debates in Europe about the role of science. We have another debate that is emerging right now, big data. What big data? Big data on the other side of the Atlantic means that two companies control almost everything. And that's why farmers said, I want to keep my data, please stay away from it. In Europe, we have publicly available information. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to find ways, first of all, of advertising that we have this information and passing it around, or are we going to enter into a sterile debate about how we hide things that are already available? And I'm not talking here about what should remain private, which is certain things that farmers should have in their responsibility. So basically, I already described what we want to do with this new model of sharing responsibilities, where we have seen that the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, but we have seen also that there are practices that allow us to both modernize and simplify the policy. And what is more important is try to address these three tensions we identified in the beginning of our Inception Impact Assessment last year that we want to turn into synergies. The first tension is between the economy and the environment. And we have practices, and we saw some of them before also, that clearly indicate that it is possible to improve your economic and your environmental performance at the same time. The second tension is a tension between subsidiarity of member states and simplification. You cannot simplify if you don't modernize. But if we really modernize, then we will be able to achieve this. And the third tension, which is also a very important one, is the tension between jobs and growth. From scanning in supermarkets, to electronic banking, to robotics in hospitals or what have you, there is a real tension between what technologies do and their impact in jobs. Well, guess what? Agriculture is one of the few areas where you can generate more jobs with the use of new technologies than before, provided, of course, that there is a mechanism that will accompany this transformation and re-educate people from the farmers to advisors into what they have to do. And finally, this is all part of what we like to call budget focus on results. And it's not only like to call, it's something that needs to become part of our genes. Because we cannot keep expecting that we're going to spend all these tens of billions of euros every year without being able to explain what is the performance of the policy. That's easier to say than do, because we have a focus for years to use output indicators to check and control what people are doing. We have to start moving much more on what the performance of the policy should be. And I'll give you only one example that went into the press release of the communication. The question is, why do we need to measure the width of the hedges? Now, there are two potential answers here. We don't need to measure the width of the hedges. Member states will do it. But that is not focusing on performance. Another answer is, why do we need to care about hedges? Because they help with soil erosion, they help with biodiversity, and they help with the landscape features. And that's exactly what we have to start realizing, that we need to measure and link what we do with the policy with its performance. In all this debate, integrated pest management fits perfectly in helping this transition from conventional agriculture towards a much more environmentally friendly agriculture. What we have to resolve is how much of this is going to be helped with a conditionality, a strengthened conditionality in the so-called first pillar of the CAP, in direct payments, and how much of this and in which way will have to be helped with voluntary measures that, whether in the first and second pillar, would allow people to transit to this situation. I don't have the answers in my pocket, but that's exactly what we hope to do in the next months before we come up with the final proposal. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. For those who were expecting technical details about pesticides, You got something slightly different. But I was expecting something slightly different. Paola, you mightn't be able to escape as easily, but you mightn't want to escape as easily. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Actually, I start by saying that last year I was attending this very same symposium, and I remember that I was on this sort of apologetic mood in reassuring the audience about the real commitment of the Commission in supporting the Member State in the implementation, in particular the sustainable use of pesticide directive, that 1 year ago was dragging a bit late in his implementation. And I'm happy now to report back to you that the Commission and the Member State has been quite busy during 2017. First of all, we have finally published this long-awaited report to the Parliament, to the Council, on the National Action Plan of the Member State, which were due in 2014, and is also a report which offers an overview of the progress of the implementation of the directive on the field. The original idea was to do a report as requested by the directive, which was only focusing on the National Action Plan, which by any means valid piece of paper, but still piece of paper. So instead, we believe that it was more interesting to give a more comprehensive overview of the situation. And for this reason, first of all, we did a survey to all the Member States, asking to update information on how they are implementing this directive. But we also conducted what we call fact-finding missions in 6 Member States to see on the spot what these Member States, which were selected on the basis of geographical distribution and different typology of agriculture, what these Member States were doing in reality. And this, in our view, resulted in an interesting report, which is complemented by an overview report, which is a product that we do normally at the end of a series of missions. And in this overview report, you can find a detailed analysis of the findings that our auditor witnesses during their missions. So you can see also the best practice which we found in this Member State, the full result of the survey, and also the difficulties that the Member States are encountering, in particular in the implementation of the IPM rules. We have also published a guidance document on the monitoring and surveying of impact of pesticide on human health and environment, which was another obligation from the directive. But even more, we also advance on a brand new web portal, which I really invite you to visit, not only because it contains all the various reports that I just mentioned, but also because, and above all, include the links to all the websites of the Member State dedicated to the implementation of the directive and IPM. So at the moment, I think that we have 27 links. The last one is coming soon. But I would invite everyone to make full use of these facilities because it's very informative, in particular to exchange best practice. We have also wrote officially to all the Member States, to the ministers, highlighting area for improvements that we have identified in looking at their national action plan. And Member States are replying to us, 25 has already done, indicating a very high level of commitment and engagement. And the minister, the agriculture minister, confirmed this commitment at the November Council meeting, highlighting, however, a number of issues which are impeding or slowing down the implementation, and I'm coming to that, to those a bit later. And I really would like also to mention here the Commission response to the European Citizen Initiative ban glyphosate. You might be very familiar with this. Because as we say in our response, this was really a moment for the Commission to have an inside reflection on our policy on pesticides. And looking at the response, you will see that many actions are already announced in terms of transparency on studies, for example, for the evaluation of pesticide. But for the sustainable use is really aim 3, the one that is particularly concerned, where we have made a number of reflections and also a number of commitments that we are going to honor. Now, back to the focus of the symposium is integrated pest management. I start by stating a fact, because when we had the first meeting with the member state in our working group, there was some member state which was questioning the fact that IPM is compulsory. So they were sort of saying, well, it's not really an obligation. It is indeed. And I hope that now this is clear and well accepted by all the member states. So if you look at the Commission report, the level of the implementation of IPM in the member state is various. In general, is reflecting the situation of the implementation of the directive in the member state, which remain quite patchy. You have member states that are more advanced than the other. And on IPM in particular, the result is that it remains underused by the member states. The member state focus on promoting IPM rather than assessing compliance at grower levels, again, which is probably a result of the fact that they believe that IPM is not really an obligation in our legislation. And most importantly, there are no clear criteria and targets to measure the proper implementation of IPM. And this is a problem, an horizontal problem that we have in all the implementation of the Sustainable Use Directive. So the fact that there are many rules, many requirements, that the member state on paper indicate they are doing, but by not having criteria, by not having indicators, they cannot prove, they cannot demonstrate, they cannot assess themselves if the goal of the directive, the progress of the directive are measurable and met. So let's start with a good note. First of all, in the main finding on IPM is that in all 28 member states there is support tool. There are support tools for growers. Now, I heard some previous intervention about the quality of this kind of support, which is reflected in our observation. It is variable. Let's put it like this. There are also in place networks everywhere for pest monitoring warning system. Advisory services are everywhere. And also there are demonstration farms network. We have identified very good practice that I go very quickly, but one is in the Netherlands where they have a truly plant protection monitors with record keeping, which allow them to evaluate the success or not of the action taken. We have also another good practice in IPM based on these two systems, the ISIP and the ZEP, which are supporting, again, farmers and the advisor in decision making. We have the SEGES, which is the Danish Farm Advisory Service, which has developed a number of tools, smartphone application, webinar, videos, which are very useful. Interesting also to signal a good practice in Italy. We were talking before about the variety of landscape, territory, climate in Europe. In Italy, this is all even emphasized. I mean, the difference in Italy between north and south is incredible, and Italy has decided to do a sort of very generic, broad guidelines on IPM, which are now then sort of translated at the regional level and in a more useful way, are declined in accordance to the problematic, the difference of the territory. And Poland as well has a very informative web portal. But more interesting perhaps after what we have heard this afternoon are the obstacles to a better implementation of IPM. And in hearing some intervention, I think that this is reflected a bit in our findings as well. First of all, again, the absence of clear criteria for checking IPM compliance. Possible conflict between IPM and other requirements, for example, the requirement of minimum tillage. The lack of financial viable non-chemical control technique, lack of research into alternative way of control. Farmers which are also legitimately reluctant to apply alternative method to classical chemical if they face unacceptable risk from economic point of view. There are economic incentives that also may conflict with using all available tools, lack of alternative to cereal crops in certain member states in particular, or poor financial return from alternative crops, lack of pesticide authorized for minor crops, and we are entering also in a problematic of the low-risk active substance that I'm sure is coming back, and the financial constraint on the advisory system. The advisory system is, as just mentioned, a fundamental tool, an obligation, and member states are investing a lot in this, and the results are mixed in this respect. So what are the next steps then for the Commission? First of all, now all the various elements of the directive are in place. So we are moving now to a different level, let's say, of communication with the member state. Before I mentioned that we conducted fact-finding missions. Fact-finding missions are missions in which we are going to see what's going on, to gather information, and draw some conclusion. This is a lighter way of, let's say, checking the monitoring of a legislation, of requirements. But now we move to the audit. The audit is a very formal kind of inspection that we do in member states, at the end of which we gave a recommendation to the member state to which they have to provide action plan. So the dialogue is moving from a very friendly, how are you, what are you doing, to let's move on now and let's see if you're doing what the legislation is asking you to do. Member States now this year are going to send us the revised National Action Plan, and all these should then lead to a new report which should really allow us to decide what's next in terms of policy option. More specifically, we are supporting member states on IPM enforcement. IPM is a cornerstone of this directive. Member states, as indicated, have difficulties, so let's help them. We are doing this through our work program, which is called Better Training for Safer Food. We have already planned 14 of such training, which will outreach around 400 colleagues in Europe. And above all, and I think that this is most important, we are going to support the member state in establishing criteria for assessing the implementation of the 8 IPM principle. And we have already started actually last year, and the next step will be a meeting with the member state to discuss this in March. And this is probably the most difficult challenge. In the directive, there is an obligation for the Commission to establish harmonized risk indicator. And this will be, first of all, a very difficult challenge because no one has yet clear idea of which will be the most appropriate risk indicators to select, but they are hugely important because this will allow all of us to assess the level of use of pesticide and the impact of the risk of pesticide in the European Union, and then to decide on possible policy options, including the one evoked in the citizen initiative. So, wish the Commission good luck on this, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Paola. What we've got in the next 20 minutes or so, 3 MEPs who will give us their perspective. Their perspective, at least I hope, from the viewpoint of 2 things. First of all, the work that you have to do in the Parliament's view on the Commission report. I fully understand the way these things work, but in the light of what both directors from the Commission have said, there are interesting things that you might be able to do that force Sante and Agri to be friends. The farmer and the cowboy should be friends. DG Environment, of course, is not represented at this table, but I just mentioned them nevertheless. Because what's done is done, and it seems there's a slightly different emphasis now. But having said that, I'm only giving the views of a retired public servant. Jutta Gutland, you, the job, as I understand, as rapporteur. Can you give us some views from your perspective at this stage, and then I'll go to my colleagues on the left.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you all today about this important topic. I think that we had very interesting panelists before today and in this panel, and I will take with me many of the ideas that was presented today. As the ENVI rapporteur on this implementation report on the Sustainable Use Directive, I will, and I also want to take this opportunity to say thank you both to PAN for arranging this and also for Pavel for hosting it, and most of all to all of you who are here. I think it shows how important this is. I want to say just a few words about who I am, and don't be worried here. I'm not going to turn into a philosopher about my existence, but maybe it's interesting to know why I think this is so important. In my spare time, I often spend time in the countryside in Sweden, in a small village in the northern part or / center part. We have a very long country. And I put on my rain boots and I go out and I go on the fields and in the lands and the forest in that very small village. And of course, for me, it's very important that it can continue to provide income for the people who work and live out of the land and the forest, and also do so in a sustainable way. I'm also the mother who goes into the store with some. There, I have some existential problems, actually. I have so many choices that I want to fulfill. I want to provide my kids with good, healthy food, who is good for them and their health. And I also want to provide the closest area where I live with economic benefits. I think it's important to have it as close as possible. I want to be good for the climate. I want to make sure that we don't have unnecessary long transports. And I have the same thinking when I'm in Belgium as in Sweden. Of course, I want to use Belgian products as much as possible. And when I go to France, I have the same interest in helping the local producers. And then I'm also a person who, in front of this, the last election to this parliament, was many turned to me and wanted me to be Madame Bee, who would protect the bees and their future. Many beekeepers came, and it was friends and many around Sweden who really worried about the death of the bees and how we see that happening in Europe and what that would make, what kind of problem that would create for the future. And now let me very smooth go into what I think is the macro level problems and challenges that Europe face. I think the common agriculture policy, when we now are going to revise it and change it, I think it's very important that we make sure that we have a heterogeneous system that will work for different kind of farmers. I also think it's important that we combat climate change and that we have going into the next to the future with sustainable alternatives regarding the climate. But I also think it's important that we have people's health in our minds. For me, it's both the farmers, especially the farmers who actually come close to chemicals and are the ones who mostly are exposed, but also the public health, of course. And promoting solutions for more sustainable agriculture and phasing out the toxic substances from our soils, that is a really important part of this puzzle that EU needs to put together now. And I think we need to step up our actions and make this a more important task for the Commission and also, of course, for the deciding institutions. And I think the integrated pest management is a very important and fundamental measure in the Sustainable Use Directive in order to achieve this good transition to the future. And the various and recent reports from the Commission and also what was presented here today clearly shows that the Member States are not doing enough. And they are not implementing the SUPD directive enough. And therefore they are not supporting the low-risk pesticides and non-chemical methods enough. In fact, there are numbers of shortcomings that we see and need to be addressed in this progress. This is also something I will take further into my work and what I believe we need to do. We know that many farmers use established chemical pesticides instead of trying other alternatives, and that's not the fault of the farmers. They are just trying to make sure that they are growing the crops. But we need to phase out the unsustainable pesticides and make sure that we have a usage that is more sustainable. And in order to do so, we need to change the incentives here so that farmers can reduce their usage of pesticides and to a greater extent switch to more sustainable and non-chemical options. Accordingly to Principle 4 of the IPM, the availability of sustainable biological, physical and other non-chemical plant protection methods should be given a preference to chemical plant protection methods. However, according to the Commission's data, and we saw it now also, Member States highlight the insufficient availability of low-risk and non-chemical pesticides are a barrier to further IPM development. This means that there are not enough alternatives on the market, and we really need to adjust that in order to facilitate the uptake of non-chemical alternatives on the market. Furthermore, if low-risk alternatives are available, but they are not effective as chemical ones or would involve higher cost, the users would not comply with the IPM requirements. And against this background, I think that we need to get a better understanding on how the development and the rollout on markets of low-risk effective alternatives can be further supported so that these products become more attractive for the manufacturers. In Sweden, for instance, there is a strong and still increasing consumer demand for organic product, and over 50% of the Sweden's farms' land are now devoted to organic production. The EU average is roughly 6%, and I think we should look how we can increase that further also. I also want to say a few words, I know time is running, but very few words on a very important topic that I also mentioned in my beginning, and it's about the mass death, I should say, of insects. German studies shows that in summertime there are 80% diminished, the insects are diminished by 80% over the last 30 years. I mean, I said 80%. That's huge. And this is really going to be costly for the farmers and for the production in the EU. And of course, this development is, it's a tragedy if it would happen, so we really need to do something about this and increase our effort. And unfortunately, biodiversity problems are not new. It's on the contrary. But there are many reasons for this decline, and that we can address. We can address why. The scientists are saying that they want to look further into chemicals and what they are doing and what's happening. They don't think that it's the climate change here. They think actually it's the pesticides and other chemicals cocktails that is causing this problem. So again, this shows that how integrated pest management is really a central tool for the future. So I will conclude with how we can achieve the best actual results. We know that current practices in member states are quite diverging. Different countries are working with this in different ways. I think a certain amount of flexibility is necessary, and that's not a bad thing. After all, the directive and the situation in the member states differs a lot. Therefore, it might be necessary to have a certain amount of flexibility for the implementation of the IPM practices. However, I believe it would be very valuable to provide more guidance and more directions to member states where possible. And therefore, I think it would be good to develop a set of common EU-level guidelines for the various IPM principles that would underpin the proper IPM implementation. For example, the Commission's reports show that the reduction of quantities used have not given you results, and that the reduction of concentrations of active substances could bring additional value, shown is in examples in the member states, not at least Denmark, has been mentioned by previous speakers here. There are also member states where such guidance has been developed at national level, and that also brought positive results. So I think that Feasibility on achieving greater benefits by focusing on concentrations rather than volume could be further assessed, as well as whether the practices in aforementioned member states can be transferred into other MS with similar results. There are many things to be said about IPM and the overall implementation of the directive, but I think I will stop here and just add that I look forward to the process ahead to maximise the potential for this directive and IPM to make the most possible contribution to Europe's transition to a more sustainable future. Thank you so much. I try to really hurry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What I appreciate is that you have a full agenda and a document that will be worthwhile in so far as influencing this love affair that I was promoting there a few minutes ago. Karen, briefly if you can, please.
I'll try. Well, first of all, I want to thank you and thank especially Pavel and, of course, Jutta for their work and for the possibility to have this symposium today. My name is Karin Kadenbach. I'm also a member of the ENVI committee. I've been a shadow rapporteur on the biodiversity. I was for our group responsible for the seeds and plant reproductive material regulative, something that was really in the media all over Europe, something people were really engaged. I was also very active on all matters with Biene Meyer, because I think this was something that really hit the media, not only in Austria, but in all of Europe. So, and I'm also a member of the Agri Committee. And just being in the Agri Committee and being in the ENVI Committee, you get a lot of rather controversial and sometimes rather diametric informations on all that stuff. We have different informations in different political groups because it always depends, who are the people, who are your experts, who are the people you exchange with, who are the people you invite you to have discussions. So I very much appreciate all that, what we learned today, because it helps me to have an, let's say, informed possibility for making a decision. Because as a member of the Parliament, not being an expert in all those pesticides questions, I have to trust somebody. And as I do think that I'm responsible for my actions to the voters who sent me to the Parliament, I have to try to work and add material in their sense. So I try also to let my opinion be influenced by what I learn in the committee, in the Budget Control Committee, where I'm a member too. And we did have quite a few of very excellent reports from the Court of Auditors on subjects like greening, a more complex income support scheme not yet environmentally, or rural development programming, less complexity and more focus on results needed, or EU support to young farmers should better target it, foster effective generational renewal. So we do have a lot of information from the Court of Auditors where we see how European legislation is implemented, how it works, and I think we have to have this approach that we are not allowed to think in silos, but really have to look at all those things. They are interacted. And one problem we see in all those legislations and all those implementations, we have this, as you mentioned a few times today, the problem that it's very hard to measure if European legislation, if what we want should be done is really done and if it's really delivering. So that's very important that we have this criteria to assess the implementation of the 8 IPM principles, and also what I'm really looking for is the harmonized risk indicators, because right now we do have the possibility to get a lot of very controversial information based on scientific data. So what I hope for the future, that we can continue this kind of dialogue as we have right now, because we do see that the Europeans have a great need for a healthy environment, healthy and safe food, and that's actually what we want to guarantee. And we only can do that if we have methods of producing food and feed in a very sustainable way, where we really know that we can, or at least right now, we have to have some plant protection. So that's one point with the glyphosate discussion I see. I mean, we have to found our decisions on scientific data. But as politicians, we also have to take into regard what people feel. So if we don't have good explanations, if we don't have good arguments, they won't trust us. And I think this is one of the big problems we have in the near future, talking about the multi-annual framework, financial framework. Because if Europeans do not understand why we need money for our agriculture and for the rural development, they will not be willing to pay, because it's taxpayers' money. So I think this is a very, very good moment to shape the future common agriculture policy in a way that Europeans know that public money is used for public goods, and that it's them and our environment that will be profiting from these investments in the future. Thank you.
And finally, Nicola Caputo.
Thank you. Grazie mille.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I'm sorry that I'm late, but it's a very busy time for me, and I've got lots of things going on, both in my personal and political life. But I was very sorry not to be here for the whole event. We've got such a high level of scientific, technical and political participants here. So thank you very much to Pavel for organising this. And I have worked together with him in this parliament, together with other colleagues here. But thank you also to Pan-Europe. This is one of the most valuable NGOs that we have for the work that it does in the fight against the use of pesticides and its promotion of alternative practices. Plant protection products that are low risk are a valid alternative and to the conventional products, and this is true both for traditional and organic farming. The way these products work in the new generation of products could bring significant benefits to agriculture. Nonetheless, a number of member states refuses to authorize such products because they are presumed to be less effective. There was a resolution in March last year in this Parliament in which we asked the Commission a question, and we're still awaiting a response. We asked for a review of the regulation on plant protection products, and we wanted to improve the current registration procedure for the basic substances that are low risk. And this is sometimes done with the requirement of having a patent, and this makes it very difficult to register the product. In October, the Commission adopted its report on the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive. And this is encouraging in some ways, but overall we found it to be rather incomplete in other aspects. The national action plans are the basis for member states to control the requirements of the directive. But there's a big difference in terms of coverage and effectiveness. There are many great differences in the ways that this is applied and in the measures that are implemented. There are also inconsistencies in definitions for quantitative targets, measures, and the range of interventions. The French National Action Plan is currently the most ambitious, and it aims to reduce the use of pesticides by 50% by 2025. with an initial threshold of 25% by 2020. And this is going to reduce the risks to human health and to the environment. The directive is also not comprehensive as regards the adoption of measures by member states to protect the aquatic environment. There are no measurable targets in most national action plans, and this makes it very difficult to assess the progress that's being made. The same is true for the storage and use of pesticides. It's only in the Italian plan that there are details on storage, use, dilution and mixing of pesticides before their application. Or this also covers the packaging and the disposal of residues and mixes that remain in the equipment after its use. Clearly, there is a lot that needs to be done here when we're working in this Parliament on the SUD directive. And generally, we are quite at the forefront of such policies. And work is also being done at global level, for instance, by the United Nations. And this, all the work that's being done here stresses the word sustainability. Any other kind of policy is totally anachronistic and pointless. This is all a matter of having a successful transition in the quickest possible way. These meetings such as this are very useful because they lay the groundwork and they raise awareness among the public opinion before decision makers can take action. I'd like to congratulate Pavel for organising such a great meeting, and to Pan Europe and all the speakers for the important contributions that they have brought to this debate. That will certainly be borne in mind when we carry on our parliamentary work here, and I hope that the dialogue that we've seen today will continue in the weeks and months to come, so that we can continue to achieve better and better results. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the three MEPs. I think they've covered the ground. I could open for discussion, but I have a feeling that I would be respected more if I didn't, because everybody wants to have their dinner. Well, that show of hands convinces me. Thank you. I want to make a few very quick conclusions. The first one in relation to today. And I look across to the people at the table. Soil is more important than we have seen before in any discussion over the last 5-6 years when we have been doing these symposia. Soil is more important. Now you might say, well, he'd say that anyway. The indications today in the first session made that very clear indeed. So we must pay more attention in whatever way we deal with this directive and its relatives. The second point to make is that two farmers here this afternoon said IPM works for them. They have to work for it, but it works for them, and it works for them in the Grand Culture, in arable farming. That's a hugely important message. It is as if President Obama was here. Yes, we can. IPM, yes, we can. Or as we say at home, is Féidir Ling. Yes, we can. That is possible. I've been encouraged, I'm not going to let you off the hook, but time is going to let you off the hook. But I have been encouraged, in fairness, by the progress that Sante has made over the last year when we were begging for the report, and by the work that you have been doing since. I read, which shows a further degree of lunacy on my behalf, I read the press release with the release of the report. And in the press release, the Commissioner for Sante said Sante would be encouraging and supporting member states to implement the directive. That's what he said. Now, I take that in two ways. First of all, the things that you are doing. And secondly, in understanding that if you go to DG Agri, who have a good deal of power and influence and importance for this directive, in the CAP reform, you have some real chances. Tassos said renationalisation is not relevant, and I think what you said was unless EU objectives are being addressed. I think that's what you said, more or less. And EU objective is IPM, and it's not IPM to make PAN happy. It's IPM because it's European legislation, and it's IPM because citizens are looking constantly in this direction, and because IPM is good for a whole load of other things, including soil protection. I think this meeting gives us some reason for optimism. And that optimism needs its translation into what the Parliament will say in its conclusions on the Commission report, in driving home the issues that actually each of the three MEPs here mentioned very clearly in relation to what is expected of a directive that is 9 years old, relatively young, but needs a great deal of further encouragement to be translated into something that every member state can be proud of. And you have a huge task, and I wish you well with the task. Because there are benefits for health, there are benefits for the environment, and there are benefits for agriculture. So there's a lot of work to be done. Finally, having said all that, I want to add to the thanks that has been expressed on behalf of by Pavel, or for Pavel, in hosting this meeting now, I think, for the 5th or the 6th time. And I want to, on my own behalf, thank the organisers for having invited me to be chairman yet again. It shows imagination is not great yet. So thank you all very much. Thanks to the speakers here and to the interpretation service, my old friends from my environment days, and a safe home to you all. Thank you.